Hey everybody, this is a section from a chapter in Diethard, Behrens, and Kornelia Hafner's Western Marxism and Introduction. The chapter is titled The Philosophy, on the Marxism and Existentialism, on the Philosophy and Theory of Jean-Paul Sartre 1. The last section we read was titled Philosophy and Existentialism 3. This section is titled A Brief Note on Heidegger. Here we go. Here the focus is on Heidegger the philosopher. His work has frequently elicited both encomiums and attempts at critical engagement. Footnote. It must be noted with a caveat that this study does not examine the complete body of work, but draws only upon the portion relevant to Sartre's reception of it. Consequently, with few exceptions, the following are largely excluded: writings from the period prior to being in time, Sein und Zeit, as well as, despite some mentions, aspects of Introduction to Metaphysics, Einführung in die Metaphysik, what is metaphysics, and Introduction to Philosophy, all of which appeared from the late 1930s onwards. Thus, no explicit reference is made to the reception of Nietzsche or to the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, die Grundbegriffe der Metaphysik, the influence of Abraham. Sancta Clara is addressed only partially, and no consideration is given to the exegesis of scholasticism, the indirect influence of Arthur Gobineau's Essai sur l'inégalité des races humaines, Catholic theology, the existentialism of Jaspers, or the specific phenomenological tradition. Footnote. By way of example, see Florian Grosser, Revolutionäres Denken, Heidegger und das Politische, 1919 to 1969. Here one finds national revolutionary perspectives and apologetics for Heidegger and Schmitt. See Paul Sorensen and Nikolai Munch's edited volume Politische Theorie und das Denken Heideggers, published in 2013 transcript. Much of this work explores the extent to which political theory can draw upon Heidegger. Reference should also be made to the Schmitt Renaissance in Polish discourse. See the article Politischer Katholizismus, Political Catholicism by Peter Grasik in the journal Kronos. Schmitt and Heidegger are in vogue. There is a renewed search for, quote, metaphysical principles, end quote, and the, quote, revelation of being, end quote. See Carol Sauerland, Sein und Entscheiden, Karl Schmitt unter Polens Intelligenz. End footnote. Let's single out one for the start. Jürgen Habermas, Heidegger, Werk und Weltanschauung, forward. In Victor Farias, Heidegger und der Nationalsozialismus. Regarding Heidegger's biography, see also Rüdiger Safransky an Meister aus Deutschland, Heidegger und seine Zeit, published in 1994. Back to the body. Habermas observes that as of 1976, a proper discussion of Heidegger had not yet really taken place. Since then, however, the situation has improved with the publication of volumes from the collected works and various historical studies. Habermas argues against disparaging the philosopher on account of his politics, noting that his work has long since detached itself from his person. Heidegger combined, quote, Diltheian hermeneutics and, quote, Husserlian phenomenology, unquote, with Scheller's, quote, pragmatist motifs, unquote, therefore achieving a, quote, historicizing overcoming of the philosophy of the subject, unquote. Habermas. Aristotelian metaphysics and Kierkegaardian, quote, existential dialectics, unquote, also played a role, such that Heideggerian philosophy represents arguably the most profound watershed in, quote, German philosophy since Hegel, unquote. Habermas. In this respect, Heidegger founded a school of thought. While the philosophical dimension should not be discredited, room must nonetheless be made for historical and philosophical inquiry. Footnote: being in time remains significant, even though his, quote, political conduct. So, and this is, I guess this is like kind of like saying, like explaining what Habermas is saying. But the footnote says, being in time, the book, remains significant, even though Heidegger's, quote, political contact arguably casts a, quote, shadow, unquote. Thus, quote, the assumption that the substance of this work could be discredited by a political assessments of Heidegger's fascist engagement is wide off the mark, unquote. Habermas. Lukács's view corresponds to this picture in a specific way. Lukács classifies Heidegger as a representative of pre-fascism. See Georg Lukács, Appendix, Heidegger Redivivus, Heidegger Redivivus, in Existentialismus oder Marxismus, Existentialism or Marxism, 1951. It is not surprising that Lukács seeks to exonerate Heidegger, noting that it appears as though the latter is moving, quote, closer to Marx than to Sartre, end quote. And footnote. Footnote: as can be seen, Habermas partially concurs with this view. Heidegger's, quote, detranscendentalization, end quote, and above all his critique of reason render him the, quote, idealist counterpart, end quote, to the proponents of the critique of, quote, instrumental reason, end quote. Admittedly, he abstracts, quote, from social contexts of life, end quote. Nevertheless, the account takes an apologetic tone. His work, quote, On the Truth of Being, end quote, dating back to at least to the 1930s, is discussed with any political context. The, quote, turn, Kera, of that period entails, among other things, quote, the metaphysical unfolding of the critique of reason, end quote. Heidegger, Habermas. Nevertheless, the account, where the hell am I? Admittedly, Habermas, I need to restart this whole footnote. As can be seen, Habermas partially concurs with this view, and the view is what? The sentence, while the philosophical dimension should not be discredited, room must nonetheless be made for historical and philosophical inquiry. Actually, that's not it. Fuck. Aristotelian, what it's referencing is Aristotelian metaphysics and Kierkegaardian, quote, existential dialectics, and, quote, also played a role, such that Heideggerian philosophy represents arguably the most profound watershed, quote, in German philosophy since Hegel, end quote. Sartre. Habermas. Jesus Christ. And the footnote says, as can be seen, Habermas partially concurs with this view. Heidegger's, quote, detranscendentalization, end quote, and above all, Heidegger's critique of reason render him the, quote, idealist counterpart, end quote, to the proponents of the critique of, quote, instrumental reason, end quote. Admittedly, he abstracts, quote, from social contexts of life, end quote. Nevertheless, the account takes an apologetic tone. His, quote, work on the truth of being, end quote, dating back at least to the 1930s, is discussed with any political context. The, quote, turn, parenthesis, Kara, of that period entails, among other things, quote, the metaphysical unfolding of the critique of reason, end quote. Habermas, quote, we also owe enduring insights to Heidegger's critique of reason, which began with his 1931 interpretation of Plato and unfolded between 1935 and 1945, primarily through his engagement with Nietzsche, end quote. Habermas. Quote, no simplistic connection should be drawn between the work and the person, ... In Germany, therefore, the critical appropriation, sick, of a mode of thought infected by a specific worldview can only succeed if we, sick, who learn from Heidegger, acknowledge the internal relationships existing between Heidegger's political engagement and the shift in his attitude on the one hand, and the argumentative trajectory of a critique of reason that was also politically motivated on the other, end quote. Habermas. In this respect, it is clear why Habermas was fascinated by being in time at the time. See his own admission to this effect. A peculiar assessment is also found regarding the realm of the, quote, political. Heidegger was allegedly never a racist, but rather a cultural anti-Semite. Footnote, quote, just as the truth content of a theory must not be discredited by associating it with something external to it, neither can nor should a complex figure of objective spirit, when possessing a powerful tradition, be placed under total protection or immunized against the question of whether substantive motives and worldview-based motives have become intertwined within it, end quote. Sartre. I keep saying Sartre, this is the last thing I was reading. Habermas. End footnote. Back to the body. For Habermas, the, quote, overcoming of the approach based on the philosophy of consciousness, end quote, is crucial. However, certain limitations in being and time must be noted at the outset. The assumption of a, quote, invariant fundamental constitution of Dasein, end quote, blocks access to history. The category of, quote, being with, end quote, mit sein, obstructs access to socialization and intersubjectivity, end quote. The construction of, quote, truth as unconcealment, end quote, fails to account for the validity of translocal elements, and his solipsism causes him to overlook morality. Footnote, quote, the analysis of Dasein carried out in being and time remained a theory of, quote, being in the world, end quote, in general, end quote. Habermas. Nevertheless, Habermas critically points to Heidegger's concept of destiny, end footnote. Footnote, drawing on Franzen, it is argued that there is, after all, a possibility of the political emerging from being in time. C. W. Franzen, Martin Heidegger, published in Germany, 1975. Back to the body. Heidegger's evolving views, shaped by Heidegger's engagement with actual National Socialism, to which he contrasted his own ideal version, had led him to construct a narrative of decline. On the one hand, a, quote, turn from existential ontology to, quote, being historical, end quote, thinking, end quote, is said to have occurred around 1930/31. This phase also involved a reflection on language in terms of the history of being. However, the specific terms and concepts defining the, quote, history of being, end quote, were still absent at this stage. Although full-blown decisionism emerged only later on, changes were already evident at this point. One concerned individualism, the other the concept of truth. On the other hand, Habermas identifies a limited, quote, turn as early as 1929. Yet this turn exists only insofar as A, the analytics of Dasein are reflexively traced back to a movement of metaphysical thought interpreted as a history of decline. B, the worldview-driven motives of crisis diagnosis, unfiltered by scientific rigor, can flow into this reconstruction of the present. And C, the dialectic of truth and untruth can be decoupled from the individual's concern for their own existence and interpreted as an event, thereby stylized into a challenge regarding a, quote, shared historical destiny, end quote. Consequently, the concept of, quote, self-reflection, end quote, and, quote, self-assertion from being in time could then be interpreted in a, quote, national revolutionary, end quote, light, as elements of, quote, Dasein analysis, end quote. This position was subsequently maintained but increasingly purged of its specific contemporary context. At this stage, quote, abstraction through essentialization, end quote, i.e. the, quote, decoupling of the history of being from political historical events, end quote, played a key role. It is at this point that Habermas consolidates his critique. Associated with Heidegger are, quote, the detachment of philosophical thought from the egalitarian business of science, parenthesis, sick, exclamation point, and parenthesis, the uprooting of the emphatically extraordinary from the experiential ground of communicative everyday practice, and the destruction of equal respect for all, end quote. Habermas. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote. Habermas also considers the 1930s a turning point for Heidegger, a shift from an activist movement to a state of enduring events passively. While Mussolini and Hitler were initially regarded as elements of a, quote, counter-movement against nihilism, end quote, the leaders later appear merely as, quote, the first employees within the operational process of the unconditional utilization of things, end quote, serving to maintain the, quote, emptiness of the abandonment of being, end quote. Habermas. Footnote. Quote, in the lectures, quote, in the two lectures, quote, on the essence of truth, end quote, and, quote, Plato's doctrine of truth, end quote, the existentials are transformed from a fundamental constitution of Dasein into the result of a process originating from afar. ... The dialectic of unconcealment and concealment is now no longer conceived as the interlocking of invariant possibilities of being, which at least keeps the perspective of authenticity open for the individual, but rather as a history of decline, end quote. Sartre. I keep saying Sartre, I'm like fucking, like, that's so embarrassing. Let me repeat the footnote. Footnote, quote, in the two lectures on the quote, essence of truth and Plato's doctrine of truth, the existentials are transformed from a fundamental constitution of Dasein into the result of a process originating from afar. ... The dialectic of unconcealment and concealment is now no longer conceived as the interlocking of invariant possibilities of being, which at least keeps the perspective of authenticity open for the individual, but rather as a history of decline, end quote. Habermas. While the perspective of keeping authenticity open is emphatically maintained here, this very aspect faces criticism from another quarter. See Theodor W. Adorno, The Jargon of Authenticity on German Ideology, 1964. Adorno's critique targets this, quote, pattern philosophy, end quote. Adorno's critique targets this, quote, pattern philosophy, end quote. Footnote. Thus Habermas emphasizes, quote, the thesis of language as the, quote, house of being, in which man dwells as he exists, and to which he belongs guarding it, in relation to the truth of being, end quote. Heidegger. Oh, fuck it up. Footnote. Thus Habermas emphasizes, quote, the thesis of language as, quote, the house of being, in which man dwells as man exists, and to which he belongs guarding it, in relation to the truth of being, end quote, Heidegger, end quote, Habermas. Jürgen Habermas, the thesis of language as the house of being belongs to a later period, one in which philosophical thought has surrendered itself to a, quote, world destiny, end quote. End footnote. Footnote, quote, that critical element of being and time, which had at least been contained within the individualistic heritage of the philosophy of existence, is liquidated, end quote. Parentheses, sick, end parentheses, Habermas. Footnote: the concept of truth is now transformed in such a way that, quote, historical challenge, end quote, and, quote, collective destiny, end quote, could become dominant. End footnote. Footnote: the, quote, metaphysical reference of the national revolution, end quote. Habermas. Footnote: Habermas reports that since 1943 this pessimism has persisted. At the same time, Heidegger holds that the Second World War decided, quote, nothing essential, end quote. Habermas. The history of being, he suggests, manifests itself in the, quote, word, parenthesis, sick, and parenthesis, of philosophy, whose thinking is brought about by being itself, end quote. Habermas. The latter points to religious motifs. And footnote: the concept of, quote, the destiny of being, end quote, is upheld. End footnote. Back to the body. Associated with Heidegger are, quote, the detachment of philosophical thought from the... Oh, sorry, I already read this. So I haven't read the right footnote yet. Footnote: however, we are witnessing neither a, quote, destruction, end quote, of respect, since such talk presupposes that respect previously existed, nor does the academic establishment exhibit egalitarianism. Habermas's idealized image of the academic establishment should be contrasted with the history of the, quote, mandarins, or simply with empirical sociological research. See Angela Graf, Die Wissenschaftselite Deutschlands, Sozialprofil und Werdegänge zwischen 1945 und 2013. And footnote. Back to the body. Let us examine the extent to which the picture Habermas paints of Heidegger can lay claim to theoretical adequacy. Heidegger had already achieved considerable renown while in Freiburg. Cornelius Horkheimer sent someone to Freiburg not to see Heidegger but to see Husserl. This person also paid a visit to Heidegger. Horkheimer's verdict was one of qualified praise. Heidegger's conceptual construct does not seem to have made a particularly strong impression on him. We shall now take a brief look at that construct. Footnote: quote, we must seek not formal laws of knowledge, which are fundamentally of little importance, but material statements regarding our lives and their meaning. I note today that Heidegger was one of the most significant figures to have spoken to me, For there is one thing I know for certain about Heidegger, that for Heidegger, the motive for philosophizing springs not from intellectual ambition or a preconceived theory, but arises anew each day from personal experience. End quote. Letter from Max Horkheimer to Rosa Richer. Quote, apart from that, there is a strong materialist element in Heidegger, insofar as he posits that all ratio, indeed all thinking, is conditioned by concern for death, end quote. Max Horkheimer. Back to the body. Being in Time is still considered Heidegger's magnum opus. Being in Time is presented here neither in its breadth nor in its entirety, nor with regard to the history of its reception. Only a few brief remarks concerning its structure and certain connections are offered. The work begins with the question of the meaning of being as such, presupposing a world that is fundamentally unified. This world is held to belong to Dasein. If the universality of being transcends all generic universality as the, quote, transcendent, end quote, then the concept of being appears obscure, and the relationship between beings and being, the mode of being, the ontological difference, parenthesis, distinguishing the ontic from the ontological, in parenthesis, appears questionable or unfounded. Furthermore, being, in relation to time, had received little attention in philosophy prior to this. The task is to interrogate both being itself and the being of beings. First, one must ask what determines a being as a being, and what constitutes Dasein in the sense of, quote, ontological knowledge, end quote. Heidegger, Being in Time. Quote, Dasein as a being for whom, in its being, that very being is at issue, end quote. Heidegger, Being in Time. Or, quote, understanding of being is itself a determination of Dasein's being, end quote. Heidegger, Being in Time. The, quote, primacy of Dasein, end quote, is posited. The question of truth is drawn into the relationship between being and time. The predicate, quote, existential, is assigned to the being that relates to Dasein. The meaning of being is thus temporally determined. Time thus appears to be posited as the horizon of understanding. Footnote, quote, Heidegger holds that, at least since Aristotle, our engagement with the question of being fails to actually reach being itself. Instead, we remain stuck at the level of beings. We know being, so to speak, only in a reified, finitized form, merely as something positively given in one way or another, or simply as a positive fact reported by the sciences. Heidegger terms the, quote, distinction between being and beings, end quote, the, quote, ontological difference, end quote, and suggests that by demonstrating this difference, a primordial mode of thinking, a return to being, might once again become possible, end quote. Thomas Zuren Hoffmann, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, eine Propedeutik. See Martin Heidegger, Wegmarken. And footnote. Footnote. However, Liebrucks objects that direct access to being as the absolute implies an attempt to conceptualize a, quote, philosophy devoid of objects, end quote. And this, moreover, when thinking is equated with representation. See Bruno Liebrucks, Idee und ontologische Differenz in Erkenntnis und Dialektik zur Einführung in eine Philosophie von der Sprache her. Adorno's argument is simpler. Quote, Heideggerian being, end quote, is, so to speak, quote, a subjectless subject, end quote. See Theodor Adorno, Jahrgang der Eigentlichkeit zur deutschen Ideologie. A simple schema is also found in Lukács. Lukács classifies Heidegger under the philosophy of life, Lebensphilosophie. See Georg Lukács, Die Zerstörung der Vernunft, which I think is the destruction of reason. It becomes apparent, he argues, quote, that his ontology it becomes apparent, Lukács argues, quote, that Heidegger's ontology is actually merely an objectivistically masked anthropology based on the philosophy of life, end quote. Lukács. That there are connections to the philosophy of life is indisputable. However, Heidegger develops the philosophy of life further. Heidegger's description framed in this way refers, quote, to the states to me. It says his description. I think that's Heidegger. I don't know. His description framed in this way refers, quote, to the states of mind brought about by the crisis of imperialist capitalism in the post-war period, end quote. Lukács. Heidegger's philosophy of life is, at its core, a, quote, radical subjectivism, end quote. Lukács. As becomes clear in the description of the, quote, they. Lukács detects a, quote, anti-democratic stance, end quote, in Heidegger and regards his philosophy as irrational. Heidegger's work, Lukács claims, expresses, quote, the attitude toward life of the intellectual Philistine, end quote. Lukács. Footnote. Löwit credits Heidegger with having deconstructed the, quote, Greco-Christian tradition, end quote. Let me repeat that. Löwit credits Heidegger with having deconstructed the, quote, Greco-Christian tradition, end quote, precisely within this context. Löwit attempts to rescue theology by way of Heidegger at a time when theology had perforce to become philosophical. And footnote. Footnote. Disclosing being is said to be transcendental knowledge, quote, phenomenological truth, end quote. That is, the disclosedness of being, end footnote. Footnote. To the extent that a simple opposition is adopted here as a starting point, a reifying interpretation of being is posited, end footnote. Footnote. When the question of truth is raised in section 44 of Sein und Zeit, a psychological perspective is tacitly presupposed, according to Liebrooks. It is also worth recalling that in antiquity, aletheia signified truth, reality, true circumstances, and truthfulness. In contrast, for Heidegger, it is reduced to truth as an occurrence. It is not merely interpreted functionalistically, but exists as an event only within the unio mystica. Footnote, quote, we call, quote, existence that being itself to which Dasein relates, and quote, Heidegger, being in time. Footnote, quote, temporality is identified as the meaning of the entity we call Dasein, end quote. Heidegger, being in time. Time/temporality is to be regarded as the meaning of Dasein, which understands being, end quote. Heidegger. Back to the body, the determination of Dasein as an analysis has thus emerged as a central element. As a concept and explication, this is not undisputed. In a first approach, Dasein is the human being. Footnote, for Marcuse, Dasein in Heidegger's thought and in existentialism exists in three forms. 1. Dasein as a mode of being. 2. Dasein as a mode of being qua entity. 3. Dasein as the entity possessing this mode of being. See Herbert Marcuse, Existentialismus, Bemerkungen zu Jean-Paul Sartre's Let et le Na in Sinn und Form, 1950, and Günther Anders, Nihilismus und Existenz. End footnote. Footnote. This is what related to the determination of Dasein as an analysis has thus emerged as a central element. And the footnote says, this is demarcated from anthropology, psychology, and biology, from the philosophy of life, Lebensphilosophy, from Dilthey, and from the concept of personality in Husserl and Schiller. End footnote. Footnote, quote, humans, animals, and plants are all Dasein, bracket determinate being, end bracket, in the same sense. Yet even for the logic of being, they are not, quote, something in the same sense, but rather distinct somethings that possess their selfhood within that very distinction. The self-relation of the something negates negation by affirming itself within it. In something being, a hardness is attained that is more than mere Dasein. The something is the first ontic entity in which something like self-preservation, a state of remaining identical to itself, emerges not only in opposition to its origin, parenthesis, becoming, in parenthesis, but also in opposition to, quote, its own kind, end quote, to the other something. Heidegger spoke of how, in European thought, beings have displaced being, how the ontic, that is, the entity existing in determinacy, has thrust itself in front of being, end quote. Thomas Zuren Hoffmann. This implies the autonomization of a form within the movement of thought. Quote, with Hegel, the response would be that it is not evident why one should retreat from the stronger concept, that of the being, or the something, to the decidedly weaker one, that of being, with a capital B. Heidegger argues that this must be done for the sake of regaining a, quote, originariness, end quote, or, quote, primordiality, end quote, of thought. Now that we find ourselves increasingly ill at ease in the world of beings, in the world we have ourselves furnished with objects, he therefore concedes that the concept of being is the concept of the beginning, whereas the concept of the being, let me repeat that. Heidegger thereby concedes that the concept of being is the concept of the beginning, whereas the concept of the being implies that some sort of, quote, end has been reached. This is indeed the case, Hegel would say, but it does not follow that we ought to keep returning to the beginning. The beginning is, that which is meant to vanish and which, in essence, cannot persist. The beginning of mediation is always also the, quote, not yet, end quote, of mediation, and it sublates itself into that mediation, end quote. Quote, the, quote, something, end quote, on the other hand, is already the result of a mediation, a complex concept that does not constitute a beginning, nor due to some, quote, malaise of the history of being, end quote, but for logical reasons, end quote. And again, that's Thomas Zuren Hoffmann. And footnote, quote, the entity whose analysis is our task is in each case ourselves. The being of this entity is in each case mine, end quote. Heidegger. Quote, the, quote, essence of Dasein lies in its existence, end quote. End footnote. And the quote is Heidegger, of course. Back to the text. However, Dasein, here serving as an overarching concept, encompasses an entire scope of exposition. This requires brief characterization. Footnote. Heidegger distinguishes between characteristics of Dasein, specifically the, quote, primacy of existentia over essentia, and then Gemeinigkeit, mineness / character of being mine. The difference between Gemeinigkeit and the they lies in the fact that the former relates to the individual, while the latter relates to people in general. The ontological characteristics of Dasein are existentials, as opposed to categories which are ontological determinations of entities other than Dasein. In this sense, a distinction is made between an entity as who, existence, and as what, presence at hand, since Dasein is conceived as existence, the corresponding category of the existential, as a form of distance from entities, moves ever closer to the concept of God. The concept of the existential is a subject of interpretive dispute. For Löwit, existentials are, temporal truths, Löwit himself, however, adheres to this view only to a limited extent, by defining existing Dasein as, always one's own, Ja eigenes. The world in which it exists is also always already its world, or in existential, i.e. a mode of being of the same kind as the self, Löwit. In contrast, Lukács's conception of Heidegger's Dasein lacks sufficient differentiation. To Lukács, it appears to possess an objective character. Footnote. The orientation here follows the author's Ritzogram schematic diagram, which adopts and modifies a free-form schema. Both elements have been integrated and revised by the author. With the framework of being in the world, Dasein implies the following distinct elements. World, in terms of worldliness, equipment and environment, self, being in, and anxiety. Footnote. Löwit favors an anthropological interpretation. Emphasis is placed on Heidegger's starting point in the finite essence of man, whose Dasein is, throne freedom. Well, I don't know if I said the first quote. Let me repeat that sentence. Löwit favors an anthropological interpretation. Emphasis is placed on, Heidegger's starting point in the finite essence of man, whose Dasein is, throne freedom, Karl Löwit. The question, concerning the, truth of human existence, is deemed central. Reference is also made to, Heidegger's thesis that the one and universal being becomes accessible only through radical individuation into the specific and privileged being that I myself am, and that consequently, universal ontology requires a fundamental ontology, Karl Löwit. Footnote. The difficulty associated with this concept is fully acknowledged. The preliminary characterization of, being in the world, proceeds from an orientation toward, being in, as such. However, these determinations of Dasein's being must now be viewed and understood a priori, on the basis of the ontological constitution we call, being in the world, This unfolds as follows. 1. The circuit of the world. 2. Average everydayness of Dasein, being in as such, being in, is thus the formal existential expression of the being of Dasein, which possesses the existential constitution of, being in the world, quote, being alongside, end quote, the world, is an existential grounded in, quote, being in, end quote, end quote. Heidegger. Quote, only the understanding of, quote, being in the world, end quote, as the essential structure of Dasein makes it possible to gain insight into Dasein's existential spatiality, end quote. Heidegger. According to Löwit, designating, quote, world as an existential, end quote, entails three things. First, it is directed, quote, toward distinguishing entities present at hand within the world According to Löwit, designating, quote, world as an existential, end quote, entails three things. First, it is directed, quote, toward distinguishing entities present at hand within the world from the existing being of worldliness itself, end quote. Second, it is posited, quote, against the conception of Dasein as something, quote, present at hand, end quote, within the world, end quote. And third, it opposes the, quote, definition of world as nature, end quote. Karl Löwit. Nature is said to be a mere, quote, limiting case of the being of entities within the world, end quote. Löwit. Löwit ignores the radical subjectivization in Heidegger's thought implied by this. End footnote. Footnote. In the presentation of anxiety, not only are terms confused, the account is imprecise and serves merely to support an argument. In this context, time is conceived as being towards death. Adorno deems being toward death trivial. It contains the possibility of anxiety. There are allusions to freedom and guilt as well as passages of a religious nature. See in this regard Rüdiger Safransky Ein Meister, a piece abbreviated Ein Meister. Adorno points out that death is integral to Heidegger's concept of wholeness, ab ovo. The discourse on death, Adorno suggests, carries an implicit advocacy for war. And the he in that sentence is Adorno. And footnote, back to the body. Regarding the self, a further distinction is made between the inauthentic man, parenthesis, the, quote, they, end quote, in parenthesis, and the authentic self, through, quote, mindness, Gemeinigkeit. The essence arrives at the, quote, modes of being, end quote, of, quote, authenticity and, quote, inauthenticity, end quote, end quote. Sorry, I don't know why I added that extra quote. It's just end, quote, inauthenticity, end quote. Footnote. Löwit interprets Heidegger as restricting the concept of the human being to, quote, a pure, quote, Dasein in the human being, end quote, whose, quote, mindness, end quote, is his own, only in the same way as, quote, this is, end quote. Misunderstanding Heidegger's construction, Löwit finds the, quote, thou missing, arguing that Heidegger recognizes only the, quote, other person. This applies to Sartre as well. Back to the body. The, quote, inauthentic man, parenthesis, the, quote, they, and parenthesis, is characterized by a state of disclosure and thoroughness, as well as the activity of Besorgen, parenthesis, concernful dealings, and parenthesis. Only The sphere of the authentic self is entirely different. Here there is a projection of self-determination, and thus independence and decision-making. Footnote. This is in relation to the quote, inauthentic man, the quote, they being characterized by a state of disclosure and thoroughness, says, this refers to the quote, always already being in the world, end quote. And footnote. Footnote, the modes of being in have the quote, mode of being of besorgen, bracket, concern / taken care of, end bracket, end quote. Quote, because being in the world essentially belongs to Dasein, its being towards the world is essentially besorgen, end quote. Footnote. Sofransky renders this as follows, quote, we are given over to ourselves as a task. We are what we become, end quote. Rudiger Sofransky. However, here in the conception of freedom as potentially leading selves, Heidegger's notion of self-reification is not recognized. Back to the body, the conceptualization of the quote, authentic has provoked various reactions and criticisms. Adorno's critique is one that warrants presentation here. The quote, authentic ones, end quote, viewed as an elite in waiting, already existed in the early 1920s. Even then, the quote, authentic ones, end quote, cultivated a quote, jargon of authenticity, end quote, a quote, hallmark of a socialized sense of being chosen, at once noble and cozy, end quote. Adorno, jargon of authenticity. The quote, authentic signaled something, quote, higher, end quote. The question regarding the meaning of being, end of life, was rife. In contrast to these ordinary, quote, authentic ones, end quote, Heidegger stands out. Heidegger is associated with the, quote, ideology of pure substances, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Adorno highlights two aspects. By pointing out that the, quote, illumination of existence, end quote, is obscure, Adorno criticizes the illusory radicality of the questioning involved. Quote, yet the question concerning meaning, as that which truly is, and what lies hidden within it, often imperceptibly, and therefore all the more promptly, sweeps away the question concerning the legitimacy of that very, quote, something, end quote, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. Regarding the, quote, authentic, or das Eigentliche, as a, quote, gesture, it is noted that its proponents sided with the, quote, historical victors, end quote, this being the, quote, substantial element of authenticity, end quote. Adorno. Back to the body. Heidegger's man is depicted as the distanced yet pleasure-seeking big city dweller, as well as, quote, ordinary folk in general, to whom the authentic individual stands in opposition. It is evident that for Heidegger, idle talk, parenthesis, Gerede, and parenthesis, is attributed to those ordinary people. In a sense, this also reveals an attitude hostile to thinking, directed against rootless intellectuals. Yet the negated subject, like the concealed social dimension, manifests itself within the observed consciousness. Adorno argues that this hidden subject lies at the core of Heideggerian metaphysics, which in Adorno's view is fraught with contradiction. For Heidegger, the, quote, authentic signifies the essential. This entails a host of difficulties for him. This points toward a different discussion. Three distinct lines of connection emerge from being in, state of mind, understanding, and discourse, parenthesis, as distinct from language, in parenthesis, while state of mind, as a pre-reflective relation to the world, is intended to point back to anxiety, parenthesis, which constitutes a motive for the necessity of a projection, in parenthesis. Discourse is linked to idle talk, that of the quote, they, end quote, parenthesis, das Man, in parenthesis, and ultimately to reticence. Anxiety, reticence, and the projection generated from understanding are finally brought together again within being in. Understanding, however, points to a specific phenomenological hermeneutics. This hermeneutics exhibits pragmatic, existential, and ontological moments. The orientation of understanding is directed toward, quote, reality as a whole, unquote. Understanding as the, quote, ability to be of Dasein, end quote, must be grasped as an analysis of Dasein related to the, quote, meaning of being, end quote. Understanding must be conceived as something productive. It is both pre-linguistic and linguistic exegesis. Methodologically, hermeneutics unfolds through the formation of prejudices, their systematization and experimentalism. Thus, understanding points to a specific mode of comportment, which marginally includes curiosity, as well as to subjective moments and ultimately to projection. The relation to world, self, and being in is consolidated into care, parenthesis, Zorge, end parenthesis, as the being of Dasein, and as a structural whole. This is intended to encompass the temporal dimension in the transition from the facticity of, quote, already being in the world, and, quote, existentiality as, quote, being ahead of oneself, end quote, and falling as, quote, being alongside, end quote, to past, present, and future. For Heidegger, time is unitary, while the past, as that which has been and as a mandate, remains present. The present is effaced for the sake of the future. Heidegger entirely lacks a reflexive concept of time. Footnote. There's a number of footnotes here. Thus, the authentic possesses an authoritative quality vis-a-vis its, quote, other. Authenticity, however, like Weber's value, is said to be pre-rational. Footnote. At this point, however, Adorno notes that the compulsion of social conditions also prevails behind the, quote, one, end quote, parenthesis, man, end parenthesis, and that in this respect, quote, care, end quote, parenthesis, Zorge, end parenthesis, must also be understood primarily as the concern of ordinary people, end footnote. The next footnote is in reference to the line, in a sense, this also reveals an attitude hostile to thinking, directed against rootless intellectuals. Footnote. This stands in contrast, and the footnote in relation to this says, this stands in contrast to the specific, quote, Heideggerian mythology of the essence of being, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. Footnote. The social dimension in Heidegger's, quote, authenticity is also revealed in the fact that subjectivity is replaced, quote, by Dasein, whose essence is existence, end quote. Yet embodied in the construction of Dasein is the, quote, transparency, is the, quote, transparency, end quote, of the self, end quote, which allows one to proceed, quote, from a being as an immediate datum, end quote, of the facts of consciousness, and thus demonstrate that Dasein is consciousness, end quote, Adorno. Reference to Søren Kierkegaard, The Sickness unto Death. Citation according to Adorno. It seems symptomatic that, while, quote, distinguished work, end quote, parenthesis, das herausgehobene Werk, end parenthesis, appears in Heidegger's thought, labor, parenthesis, Arbeit, end parenthesis, poiesis, and ponos do not. And thus, that which is defining for the modern age, and to which Heidegger selectively refers, is also obscured. Labor. Of this, Adorno says, quote, the metaphysics of labor and the appropriation of the labor of others are complementary, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. In Adorno's work, the search for a subject is shaped by classical philosophy, while it misses the specific nature of Heidegger's construction. It nonetheless strikes upon certain elements that reveal themselves to be social factors in disguise. Footnote, quote, the social relationship that encapsulates itself within the identity of the subject is now stripped of its social character and its very being in itself, end quote. In this way, Heideggerian metaphysics becomes debased. Quote, one remains, after all, what one is, end quote. Quote, what constitutes the essence of Dasein, that is, something more than its mere existence, is nothing other than its selfhood itself, end quote. Adorno. Adorno could have arrived at this point more simply by referring to Locke, for whom property is primarily that aspect of one's own person that points to the presupposed nature of property. See Diethard Behrens' Elements of a Democratic Theory. And footnote. Footnote, Heideggerian subjectivity is said to be, quote, essence and fact in one, end quote. Dasein appears in a dual way. Quote, on the one hand, it is ontic, namely determined by existence, end quote, while on the other, Dasein is, quote, ontological, end quote. Subjectivity is thus defined in a contradictory manner. Quote, it cannot strictly be judged at all that Dasein, it, quote, is ontic or ontological, for what is meant by Dasein is a substrate, and insofar as this is the case, the meaning of the concept Dasein is something non-conceptual, end quote. Adorno, Jargon of Authenticity. And footnote. Footnote. Das Eigentliche, parenthesis, authenticity / the authentic, end parenthesis, signifies the essential. Heidegger implies that, quote, the authentic, end quote, provides a determination, quote, of things directly, end quote. It becomes a, quote, existential, end quote, a, quote, state of mind, end quote, parenthesis, Befindlichkeit, end parenthesis. Nevertheless, authenticity remains merely a formal concept. The primacy of the concept is shifted, analogous to Duns Scotus's Haesitas, into singularity, thereby ontologizing the ontic. Authenticity opens the way to decisionism. End footnote. Footnote, while for Husserl this served as a method for discovering phenomena, in Heidegger's work, the framework is expanded to include the dimension of life. From the perspective of the philosophy of life, Lebensphilosophy, this implies that life unfolds within, quote, meaningful relations, end quote, and thus comprises three moments: an objectively given horizon of meaning, acting as a prior ground of determination, a partial identity of being and meaning, and an identity of world and understanding. The hermeneutic circle entails that what is presupposed within it becomes thematic once again. And footnote. Footnote. Here, there is said to be a hermeneutic and practical, quote, facticity of experience, end quote. Matthias Jung. in a piece called Hermeneutik zur Einführung. The factual as an element of significance for action within the context of life is not related to a pragmatic understanding of the term expression, because the factual is itself an expression. See Martin Heidegger, Grundprobleme der Phänomenologie. However, expression tends to have the character of a functionalist partial positivization. Understanding, according to Jung, occurs from the perspective of interest in action Matthias Jung. But this is likewise functionalist. End footnote. Footnote, existential, Martin Jung suggests, refers to the hermeneutic enactment. End footnote. Footnote, it is in relation to what? This is in relation to the sentence, the orientation of understanding is directed toward, reality as a whole, end quote. Martin Jung, is to be conceived as the, foundational science, end quote, for all other sciences. It is to be conceived as the, foundational science, end quote, for all other sciences. End footnote. Footnote. Dasein is an entity that in its being relates understandingly to that being. End quote. Matthias Jung. The human element lies in grasping, an entity in the possibility of existence, end quote. Matthias Jung. End footnote. Footnote, but because the pragmatic anticipation of meaning, the appropriation of reality within the horizon of human life interest, constitutes, being in the world, end quote, in the first place, meaning is for Heidegger logically prior to the referential, signifying aspect of language, end quote. The irrational character of this statement goes unnoticed. Footnote, historical, as Löwe interprets Heidegger, refers not to the, past as something no longer present, but rather to the past, the having been world of a Dasein that once existed, end quote. Karl Löwe. A simpler view is found in Lukács. When Heidegger states that, temporality temporalizes temporality's self as a having been present future, end quote. Heidegger, being in time, the center of Heidegger's understanding of history is said to be, subjectively experienced time, end quote. Georg Lukács, The Destruction of Reason. Lukács agrees with Heidegger that being must be historical being. For Heidegger, however, real time, end quote, is merely a, vulgar, end quote, unquote, time. Lukács. On the one hand, Heidegger argues that the illumination of Dasein can only come from within. On the other, he distinguishes between a, primary and secondary, an authentic and inauthentic historicity, end quote. This is also said to be part of Kierkegaard's legacy. Heidegger's, theological philosophy of history, end quote, is evident. And footnote. Footnote, Dasein is, world, historical, because it understands itself primarily in terms of the public shared world. Dasein explicitly hands down its factual heritage when it repeats the possibilities of its existential past with the scope of anticipatory resoluteness, end quote. and I'm not precisely sure who that quote is from. But I want to say it's Karl Löwit. But it could be Lukács, I'm not sure. And footnote. Footnote. With regard to temporality and historicity, Heidegger states that it is the, quote, resolve into the world historical situation, end quote, that is decisive. Martin Heidegger, see Martin Heidegger Being in Time, page citations. Löwit comments that this resolve attained its reality in 1933. Yeah, the Nazis came to power. End footnote. Back to the body. Heidegger defines philosophy as, quote, extraordinary questioning concerning the extraordinary, end quote. In his Introduction to Metaphysics, at the outset, though initially without explicit thematic treatment, he refers to the, quote, ontological difference, end quote, between being and beings. For Heidegger, ontology signifies, quote, the effort to bring being to expression, end quote. The, quote, question of being as such, end quote, is central to Heidegger. Being is regarded as that which is closest to human beings. In this process, attributes and functions traditionally associated with the figure of God are transferred, according to Kremer, to being. Fundamental ontology poses the question of the meaning of being. A threefold concept of ontology can be identified in Heidegger's work. 1. Ontology is identical to fundamental ontology. 2. As the, quote, doctrine of the being that is Dasein, end quote. And 3. As, quote, being devoid of the character of Dasein, end quote. For Heidegger, the reference to being and beings inherently includes a reference to Dasein. It is Dasein that commands his particular interest. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote C. Martin Heidegger, Einführung in die Metaphysik, Introduction to Metaphysics. Heidegger points to an ambiguity in philosophy as he sees it, arising from the fact that A, the, quote, essence of philosophy, end quote, is overtaxed if it is expected to, quote, provide the foundation for the specific and future historical Dasein and epoch of a people, end quote. And B, a, quote, distortion of its functional purpose, end quote, occurs if it is assumed that even if philosophy does not create the, quote, foundation for a culture, end quote, it should at least contribute to, quote, facilitating its construction, end quote, by organizing, quote, the totality of beings into overviews and systems, end quote, and keeping, quote, a world picture, end quote, at the ready. Quote, philosophy is expected to foster the practical technical operation of culture, end quote. Heidegger. Introduction to Metaphysics. And footnote. Footnote, quote, footnote. Every, quote, metaphysical question, end quote, always aims at, quote, the whole, end quote. Indeed, it is that whole. However, the starting point is to be the questioning Dasein, i.e. the individual. End footnote. Footnote. To on, it's, I guess, looks like it's a technical term, like to, to, like to, like on, like to be on something. To on, that which is, as an individual entity, designates the entity not yet disclosed by spirit. It does not refer to ontology. Ontos on, as that which is truly real, signifies, quote, authentic reality. In a later variant, this traces back to Plato and his, quote, distinction between sensibly graspable but inauthentic reality and the authentic ideal realm accessible only to thought, end quote, such that the, quote, perceptible is that which has a lesser degree of being and therefore requires, quote, participation, end quote, in being, in the ideas, since the ideas are, quote, that which truly is, end quote. H. Meinhardt. Ontology, a term emerging only in the 17th century, designates the, quote, traditional doctrine of that which is, end quote. And I'm assuming that quote is from M. Meinhardt. And footnote. And this footnote is in reference to the sentence: for Heidegger, ontology signifies, quote, the effort to bring being to expression, end quote. Here, however, the discussion of ontology traces back to Husserl, who attempts to defend the objectivity of logic in his prolegomena to pure logic, understood as ideal units and ideal walls. And footnote. Footnote. It will be seen that this assessment, and this is in relation to what? The sentence. This is in relation to the sentence: a threefold concept of ontology can be identified in Heidegger's work. 1. Ontology is identical to fundamental ontology. 2. As the, quote, doctrine of being, the being of the being that is Dasein, end quote. And 3. As, quote, being devoid of the character of Dasein, end quote. For in Heidegger, the reference to being and beings inherently includes a reference to Dasein. It is Dasein that commands his particular interest. And the footnote says, it will be seen that this assessment is justified only in part. See also the critical study by Liebrucks. See Bruno Liebrucks' Idee und ontologische Differenz. In the book Erkenntnis und Dialektik, so knowledge and dialectic, zur Einführung in einer Philosophie von der Sprache her. And I don't know what that translates as, but it should be something like Introduction to a Philosophy of Language. Something like that. I think Sprache is language, but I'm not sure. Back to the body. Being is the abstract universal presupposition of everything, especially of all beings and thus also of Dasein. Yet even in its, quote, indeterminate meaning, end quote, it stands prior to the gods, parenthesis, or God, in parenthesis, as something transcendent, as the true, quote, essence of reality, end quote. For Heidegger, it lies hidden in the dim early dawn of antiquity. It emerges outwardly in unconcealment. It is truth. At the same time, this moment, which for Heidegger constitutes the true starting point, marks the initial divergence of logos and physis. It is a point where there existed a, quote, openness to being, end quote, an openness that must be reclaimed. This is simultaneously the point at which the, quote, separation of being and thinking, end quote, takes place. A separation that since Plato has led to the dominance of thought and to philosophy's various, quote, divisions, parenthesis, being and becoming, being and semblance, being and thinking, being and Sollen, bracket, what ought to be, end bracket. Divisions that require historical transformation. Footnote. Drawing on Parmenides and based on the assumption of a distinction between metaphysical and empirical knowledge, Heidegger formulates his own position. If beings are regarded as the object of thought, parenthesis, rude, in parenthesis, and that's like a quote in reference to like the person who uses that phrase, and an quote identity of the order of thought and the order of being, end quote, is posited, thereby establishing being as the ground of thought, parenthesis, Parmenides B3, end parenthesis, as expressed by Parmenides, then being serves as the prerequisite for thought, counting as the quote true reality, end quote, that precedes everything. Consequently, for Heidegger, one must start from this being in order to enable, beyond Parmenides, a new experience of being, one that would allow, quote, historical Dasein to be enacted as historical, end quote. Heidegger. For corrections regarding Heidegger's terminology of thought, see Parmenides in Hermann Diehl's Die Fragmente der Vorsokratiker, edited by Walter Krantz. See Wolfgang Rude, Die Philosophie der Antika, 1, von Thales bis Demokrit, in the Wolfgang Rude Geschichte der Philosophie. For an in-depth discussion of Parmenides, see Hans-Peter Engelhardt, Die Sicherung der Erkenntnis bei Parmenides. Footnote. Adalon, which I guess is a word in Greek, that which is hidden was an imminent relation to Adalon, that which is hidden with an imminent relation to essence. That's what Adalon means, I guess. Footnote. The situation is somewhat different in Parmenides. Parmenides states, quote, for the same thing is knowing and being, end quote. Knowing is said to be a, quote, necessary condition for being, end quote, just as, quote, being is a necessary condition for knowing, end quote. Hans-Peter Engelhardt. It should be noted at this point, if one acknowledges the possibility of that which is, das Seiende, one comes close to the ontological proof of God's existence. Footnote. Here man has not yet stepped out of nature. Even if logos and physis have diverged, they do not yet stand in opposition to one another. End footnote. Footnote. Heideggerian being is distinguished from Hegel's, quote, empty being, end quote, and being as a generic concept. Footnote. Quote, being, which is encircled by them, must itself be transformed into the encircling circle and ground of all that is. The primordial separation, whose intimacy and primordial divergence constitute history, is the distinction between being and beings, end quote. This distinction must be, quote, reenacted, end quote, in philosophy as its starting point, parenthesis, Einsatz, end parenthesis, quote, for it is carried out based on the necessity of the beginning, end quote. Back to the body, two aspects should be highlighted here. The being must necessarily appear within a being, and that in its inception, it is defined by the concept of physis. Yet, the appearing of being is also an unconcealing, an emerging of the unconcealed. It points toward knowledge, and truth. Truth thus enters into a specific mode of the manifest or perceptible. However, being, both as indeterminate and as determinate/known, is initially grasped as a contradiction. The primordial, quote, being of beings, end quote, is that which makes being possible, serves as the decisive criterion. Footnote: Scholasticism posits hypostasis as existence conceived as a thing, Duns Scotus, Individuality is both the starting point of nominalism and an element of this context. See Martin Heidegger, Die Kategorien und Bedeutungslehre des Duns Scotus, Thomas von Erfurt, Habilitation thesis, 1915. Here, Wolfgang Haug, Here, Karl-Heinz Haug notes Heidegger, quote, concealed the fact that Scotist metaphysics is concerned with the unfolding of the, quote, ontological and, quote, constitution of beings, that is, with the question of wherein the, quote, being of beings consists. The pathos of Heidegger's entire philosophy rests on the false premise that this problem had actually been forgotten, end quote. Karl-Heinz Haig. End footnote. Footnote: Heidegger holds that truth, quote, as unconcealment cannot be an addition to being, end quote. Quote, truth belongs to the essence of being, end quote. And in a move countering ancient sensuous philosophy, outward appearance, here in agreement with Parmenides and Plato, conceals, quote, what the being is in truth, end quote. Heidegger. Semblance points to history, which is a, quote, essential realm, end quote, of the world. World, however, signifies, quote, always a spiritual world, end quote. Heidegger. Footnote: knowledge signifies, quote, being able to stand in the truth. Truth is the manifestness of beings. Knowledge is, therefore, being able to stand in the manifestness of beings, to sustain it, end quote. Knowledge is something immediate that relates to truth. In this relationship, that which is must likewise be immediate. Knowledge is something immediate that relates to truth. In this relationship, that which is must likewise be immediate. It is that which is immediately intuited. And footnote. Footnote: if Heidegger replaces the traditional concept of truth with that of Unverborgenheit, unconcealment, which is said to ground truth, then according to Tugendhat's critique, truth becomes groundless. See Ernst Tugendhat, Der Wahrheitsbegriff bei Husserl und Heidegger. With this study, Tugendhat himself had made the shift from being a student of Heidegger to an adherent of analytic philosophy. Perhaps, however, this was only a half step? Question mark. Statements within logos, including those of contradiction, are regarded in later philosophy as tools, as, quote, something handy, end quote. Back to the body. The, quote, determinateness of being, end quote, however, does not come about by chance. It arises from that quote, under which our historical existence stands, by virtue of its great beginning with the Greeks, end quote. Heidegger. It is said to be, quote, the power that still today sustains and governs all our relations to beings as a whole, to becoming, to semblance, to thinking, and to the, quote, ought, end quote, unquote. Heidegger. Introduction to Metaphysics. If being is oriented toward the beginning, then it is oriented toward history. It is the world of beings. Beings are connected to physis, and language is not external to beings. Things exist only through language. Language is therefore something presupposed. Beings are thus, quote, what they are and how they are, end quote. Just as the question concerning metaphysics is a historical one, so history is an occurrence determined by the future. Language is to be accorded essential significance. Language is said to be, quote, something that is, end quote, and to relate to the, quote, essence of beings, end quote. Heidegger. It also has to do with the, quote, look of a thing, end quote, the idea. To clarify this, Heidegger invokes the concept of parousia, P-A-R-O-U-S-I-A, as, quote, coming into presence, end quote, parenthesis, Anwesen, end parenthesis, and conveys it as presence, parenthesis, Anwesenheit, end parenthesis. Heidegger's detailed commentaries on grammar and etymology also contain a remark on thinking and language. Three elements are singled out regarding thinking, quote, representing, end quote, Vorstellen, as a mode of comportment, the analytic as an orientation of thought, and the, quote, representational grasp of the universal, end quote. Here the concept of representing points to the image, Heidegger's iconism, or, if not that, at least to metaphor. In doing so, it draws upon the philosophical concept of intuition, parenthesis, Anschauung, in parenthesis, which is rooted in the intellectual intuition of Schelling and the Romantics. Footnote. Martin Heidegger, statements within logos, including those of contradiction, are regarded in later philosophy as tools, as, quote, something handy, and, quote, I think I might have already read that one. Footnote. It is unmistakable that connotations of theosophy have been adopted. And footnote. Access to being becomes possible only by, quote, repeating the beginning of our historical spiritual existence in order to transform it into the other beginning. Okay. This is said to be the, quote, decisive form of history because it takes its starting point in the fundamental event. Quote. The beginning is repeated, quote, and that the beginning is begun again more originally. Quote. Yet access to being also implies a form of listening. This listening is directed, quote, toward the slow signs of the incalculable, quote, in which, quote, the immemorial arrival of the inevitable, end quote, reveals itself. And those quotes are from What is Metaphysics by Heidegger. Such thinking relates to an event of being in which it must listen. Quote, the absolutist tendency of the transcendental philosophical starting point in pure spontaneity finds unveiled expression in Heidegger's sovereign, quote, being, end quote. The human subject is dismissed from philosophy, end quote. Karl-Heinz Hegel, Der Fortschritt in der Philosophie, 1983. And footnote. That which is, bracket das Seiende, is firstly the world of objects, secondly that which is present, that which has been, and, quote, that which will be, end quote. Thirdly, quote, that which is as a whole, quote, that which is as a whole, end quote, all beings as existing entities, of which man is a part. Fourthly, that which is exists only in relation to man. It is then, quote, that which is in each case, unquote. And that, quote, which is, as it were, quote, makes this thing, the aforementioned, a being, end quote. Furthermore, a distinction must be made between the being itself and, quote, beingness, end quote. Zientheit. Yet that which is also defined in relation to the folk, parenthesis, people, end parenthesis. Quote, what knows no immediate resonance is everyday quote, what knows no immediate resonance in everyday life can stand in the most intimate harmony with the authentic unfolding of a people's history. What is untimely will have its own time. This applies to philosophy, end quote. Heidegger. Footnote, quote, in the word, in language, things come to be and are, end quote. Heidegger. And I think that is, what is metaphysics? I'm not sure. Anyway, quote, in the word, in language, things come to be and are, end quote. Phaeon signifies, quote, to grow, end quote. Here Heidegger breaks away from Parmenides. For the latter, being and beings are strictly separated. This is clarified in Engelhardt's interpretation, quote, whoever thinks consistently leaves the world of appearance and reaches the world of truth. This world consists in thinking, end quote. Quote, the world of truth and the world of appearance continue to stand side by side, unmediated, end quote. Hans-Peter Engelhardt. Quote, that which is defined as undivided, completed, homogeneous, motionless, and complete, end quote. What is thus exhibits an affinity with atomism. A substantiality is ascribed to it, one not yet captured by the specific term, which is conceived not physically but logically. Engelhardt identifies a circular argument. It is said that what is exists, remains the same, and thus allows for certain knowledge, when what is becomes a presupposition posited without foundation. The object is supposed to contain its determinations within itself. Quote, that, quote, being thought, end quote, and, quote, being, end quote, are always to be found in an object is an achievement of this object, parenthesis, as well as, in parenthesis, an achievement of knowing and being, end quote. Hans-Peter Engelhardt. The determination of what is, however, is subject to a decision. One must decide against the world of semblance. Footnote, if being, quote, is, quote, a state of our Dasein, end quote, then, quote, state here signifies the, quote, entire constitution, end quote. That is, quote, history in an essential respect, end quote. Reference must be made not only to this but also to language. Because the, quote, because the destiny of language is grounded in a people's specific relation to being. The question of being is intertwined within the question of language, end quote. Heidegger. Footnote, something is said to possess an essence. It stands within itself and presents, quote, itself as such, end quote. Its, quote, being, end quote, is then understood as, quote, presence, end quote. As in many places, Heidegger engages in a selective use of language and concepts, choosing those he considers to be the earlier ones. According to Plato, Phaedo, 100c, Perusia signifies the presence of the ideas within the things that participate in them. metexis. In the Christian tradition, parenthesis, Justine, I don't know, and parenthesis, it denotes the second coming of Christ to earth, and consequently the chiliasm that gives rise to the concept of the, quote, 1,000-year kingdom, end quote. Heidegger makes use of both the Platonic notion and the Christian figure, though he does not explicitly name the latter. Back to the body. Heidegger's reflection had touched upon the problem of human historicity, yet in Parmenides there is no mention of man but only of being. If one speaks of man, he must participate in the event of being. He must himself, quote, belong to being. The essence and mode of being human can then only be determined by the essence of being, end quote. Yet man also belongs to physis, then only to be determined by the essence. Yet man also belongs to physis. According to Heidegger's interpretation of Heraclitus, the identity of man emerges only, quote, in the parting of gods and men, in the event of the irruption of being itself, end quote. Beings are disclosed, quote, as man enters in, end quote, and this is necessary for him to become historical. Human potentiality generates many modes of activity. The, quote, essence of being human, end quote, can be disclosed precisely because man is cast into the exigency of being. Dasein reveals itself as that into which being erupts. Thus the essence of man is essentially determined by history. The question concerning man is, quote, a historical metaphysical one, end quote. Heidegger. It is only in history, then, that man comes to himself. The question concerning man thus leads to history and to being. Man's engagement with beings is what brings him back to being, entailing the task of transforming selfhood, quote, into history, end quote, in order to attain a, quote, stance, end quote, wherein he is himself as a historical being, thereby opening up the problem of who man is. Footnote. This is also said to be the point where aletheia emerges, truth, reality, and truthfulness all in one. However, that which is abstractly indeterminate can only be named. And footnote. Footnote. The, quote, disclosedness of beings, end quote, parenthesis, Erschlosenheit des Seienden, and parenthesis, is said to be the force that man must master. This takes up a problem from being in time once more. Violence is distinguished from resoluteness, into which willing is reabsorbed. Quote, but the essence of resoluteness lies in the disclosedness of human Dasein for the clearing of being, end quote. Martin Heidegger, Introduction to Metaphysics. The relation to being is said to be letting be, bracket, das Lassen, and bracket, as the ground of willing, something alien to the understanding. And footnote. Footnote, at this point reference is made to the limit of death. End footnote. Footnote, quote, as Dasein, in Heidegger's sense, we act within the horizon of our projections, that is, within a world, end quote. Wolfram Hochgraber, Die Selbstverstrickung des Philosophen Oskar Becker, bracket, the self-entanglement of the philosopher Oskar Becker, in Hans-Jürg Sandkühler's edited volume Philosophie im Nationalsozialismus, Philosophy under National Socialism. See regarding projection, Entwurf, Martin Heidegger, Being and Time, and footnote. Footnote, quote, the Dasein of historical man means being posited as the breach into which the overpowering force of being breaks forth as it appears, so that this breach itself shatters against being, end quote. Heidegger. Footnote, in the case of the human being, the quote, occurrence of essential belonging, end quote, arises from being and intuition. Apprehension is said to be, quote, an event in which, in the very occurring, man first enters history as a being, end quote, appears and thereby, quote, comes to being itself, end quote. Apprehension is thus something that, quote, has man. It is in this, in apprehension, that man appears. Footnote, Parmenides articulates the, quote, determination of the essence of man from the essence of being itself, end quote. End footnote. As Heidegger emphasizes in his interpretation of the choral ode from Sophocles' Antigone, man is, quote, the unheimliche, end quote. The uncanny or unsettling, a force of violence acting against the external violence of nature and carving a path, quote, into all realms of being, end quote. Heidegger. Man's place is the polis, which according to Heidegger is not merely a city-state, but the, quote, site, end quote, as in like a website or like a site of like a historical site. Man's place is the polis, which according to Heidegger is not merely a city-state, but the, quote, site, quote, the da, bracket there/here, and bracket in which and as which Dasein exists historically, end quote, as well as the site of culture. In this sense, poets, thinkers, priests, and rulers exist there. These figures are, quote, solitary ones, end quote, quote, uncanny ones, end quote. Man as the uncanny is, quote, the violent one as the creator, end quote. His spiritual potential lies, quote, solely in the mode of setting into the work itself. As history, the overwhelming being confirms itself through the work, end quote. Heidegger. Unconcealment, the truth of beings is not simply present, parenthesis, as is emphasized following the line of thought associated with Heraclitus and Parmenides, in parenthesis. Rather, it is brought forth by the work. This work exists in the diverse forms of art, thought, and politics. From this arises the necessity of a social hierarchy with poets, thinkers, and statesmen serving as leaders. Footnote, and this first footnote's in relation to the sentence, in this sense, poet, thinkers, priests, and rulers exist there. These figures are, quote, solitary ones, and, quote, uncanny ones, end quote. Here Heidegger draws upon his own definitions of the elite and the, quote, they, das Man, as well as on Heraclitus. Regarding Parmenides and Heraclitus, Heidegger highlights their misanthropy as a direct consequence of their aristocratic outlook. Otherwise, his perspective tends to resemble that of the, quote, Spartan state, unquote, whose ruling group need fear only an uprising by the metoikoi, parenthesis, resident aliens, in parenthesis. Heraclitus responds to the aristocracy's loss of significance in a world increasingly defined by trade. Heraclitus' religiously grounded thought identifies any attitude directed against the social order of estates as hybris. Against this backdrop, Heidegger emphasizes the logos as a law governing both nature and ethics, the uncreated order of the world. Actually, I'm not sure if that's the he who's being referred to. It says, I gotta reread a sentence. Regarding Parmenides and Heraclitus, Heidegger highlights their misanthropy as a direct consequence of their aristocratic outlook. Otherwise, his perspective tends to resemble that of the, quote, Spartan state, and, quote, whose ruling group need fear only an uprising by the metoikoi, resident aliens. Heraclitus responds to the aristocracy's loss of significance in a world increasingly defined by trade. His religiously grounded thought identifies any attitude directed against the social order of estates as hybris. Against this backdrop, he emphasizes the logos as a law governing both nature and ethics, the uncreated order of the world. Yet the logos is internally differentiated. It encompasses seeing and hearing as anticipations of rational insight, aspects from which Heidegger abstracts, just as Heidegger does from the numerous statements concerning contradiction and the shifting nature of insights and things. What interests Heidegger about Heraclitus is polemos, the conflict between a social states and Heraclitus' theory of the elite. Heraclitus perceives conflict within all modes of presencing. This confrontation causes, quote, some to appear as gods, others as men, some as slaves, others as free men, end quote. When Hannah Arendt speaks of the dissolution of classes under National Socialism, and in this context of elites and masses, she succumbs on the one hand to Nazi propaganda, accepting its content at face value. On the other, Arendt continues to follow Heidegger's interpretations, specifically his discourse on elites and the, quote, they, parenthesis, das Mann, in parenthesis, the, quote, ordinary people. See Hannah Arendt, Elementa totaler Herrschaft, which I guess is elements of total domination, and Elementa und Ursprünge totaler Herrschaft, which might be elements and origins of total domination. I'm not sure. The aversion to the masses is expressed emphatically. Masses, it is argued, possesses neither a common interest nor class consciousness. Totalitarian rule is said to be impossible without a mass base. They could not be, quote, structured into any organization, end quote. The thesis regarding the, quote, collapse of class society, end quote, and the nation state originates with Konrad Hayden. See Konrad Hayden, Der Führer, Hitler's Rise to Power, published in Boston, 1944, and A History of National Socialism, published in New York, 1935, cited here via Hannah Arendt. At the same time, it posits an atomistic individual and an atomistic society to which the masses owe their genesis. Arendt also holds that the masses have ended up, quote, outside of all social structures and affiliations, as well as beyond all political representations, end quote. Arendt. However, the masses are not the, quote, result of the new equality, end quote. They are the result of, quote, rootlessness, end quote. In contrast, it is stated that one belongs to a class by birth. References regarding Hannah Arendt partly provided by Thomas Schweier. Footnote, and this is in reference to the line, as history, the overwhelming being confirms itself through the work. Let me repeat that. Man's spiritual potential lies, quote, solely in the mode of setting into the work itself. As history, the overwhelming being confirms itself through the work, end quote. Heidegger. Unconcealment, the truth of beings, is not simply present, parenthesis, as is emphasized, following the line of thought associated with Heraclitus and Parmenides, in parenthesis. Rather, it is brought forth by the work. This work exists in the diverse forms of art, thought, and politics. From this arises the necessity of a social hierarchy with poets, thinkers, and statesmen serving as leaders. Sorry, I don't know why I started rereading the whole thing, excuse me. The next footnote is a reference to this specific sentence. Man is the uncanny, as, quote, the violent one is the creator, end quote. His spiritual potential lies, quote, solely in the mode of setting into the work itself. As history, the overwhelming being confirms itself through the work. End quote. And the footnote says, here the difference from Parmenides is once again clear. For Parmenides, being is also conceived as timeless. There is, quote, no time of coming to be and no time of passing away for being, end quote. Hans Peter Engelhardt. Yet in this he contradicts Heraclitus. Being is, quote, one, end quote, or there is, quote, only one being, end quote. In this respect, there are logically no, quote, many beings, end quote, for the fact that there are, quote, many can only be ascertained from the outside. Engelhardt's interpretation also presupposes that the, quote, diversity of the object domains entails the necessity of apparent knowledge, end quote. Footnote, this means that immediate presentation can only be asserted, not cognized. Footnote, the following are listed: the stone of the temple, the statue, the, quote, work of the word is thinking, end quote. The, quote, work of the polis, end quote. Heidegger. This is drawn into analogy with other things. In Greek thought, there is, quote, self-assertion, end quote, within the struggle between the powers of being and seeming. Seeming, which is associated with the lower estates, is regarded as a variant of being. This interpretation cannot appeal to Parmenides. End footnote. Footnote, the contradiction between a leader cult and the estate-based state remains unaddressed here. End footnote. Back to the body. The question concerning the, quote, essence of being, end quote, was recognized as one that simultaneously targets man. His Dasein is evident, yet specified as historical. The, quote, essence of time, end quote, is determined differently, fundamentally and, quote, solely within the realm of the question of being, end quote. The, quote, opening up of being, end quote, implies a temporal perspective, yet in such a way that it remains, quote, as such still concealed, end quote. Heidegger. The, quote, essential element is the, quote, right time, that is, the right moment, end quote. Kairos. It is merely suggested that this, That of the National Socialist Conservative Revolution is intended to be metaphysical, i.e., anti-enlightenment in nature. Footnote: Man is defined by the question of being, the essence of man, is to be grasped and grounded within the question of being, in accordance with the hidden directive of the inception, as the sight that being opens up for itself for the sake of disclosure, Heidegger. Footnote: in the essence of Dasein as such, a sight of the disclosure of being, the perspective for an opening up of being, must be originally grounded, Heidegger. Note should be taken here of this spatial metaphor and the fact that a circular argument is present. End footnote. Footnote: if ousia is named as the fundamental concept of being, this signifies constant presence, with regard to time, though time itself remains as yet unfolded. If the past is conceived as no longer, and the future is not yet, then being constitutes the perspective for the determination of time, Heidegger. A different concept of time is also presupposed. This becomes clear through a distinction made in the text. It is problematic, the text suggests, when time is merely speed, momentariness and simultaneity, and time as history has vanished from the entire existence of all peoples, Heidegger. By regarding the present, the National Socialist Conservative revolution, as the future, Heidegger closes off the horizon, yet the future is transcendence, consequently there is no history. Footnote: also hinted at here and made clearer elsewhere is the recourse to folk, people, nation, and Heimat, homeland, as a rural petty bourgeois life world. The German people are described as a metaphysical people, meaning that this people, as a historical people, projects itself, and thereby the history of the Occident, out from the center of its future unfolding into the primordial realm of the powers of being, Heidegger. The great decision regarding Europe, must come about, through the unfolding of new historical spiritual forces from the center, Heidegger. If today one recommends that science serve the people, this is indeed a necessary and noteworthy demand, yet it asks for too little and fails to address the essential matter, Heidegger. The issue at stake is greater. To achieve a transformation of science, what is required is, a grounded and truly constructed fundamental relationship to the being of beings as a whole, Heidegger. A simple political schema is outlined. On one side, technology, industry, and democracy are situated, with their geographical centers of gravity in America and Russia. On the other side, geographically the center, lies metaphysical Germany. Insofar as one wing of National Socialism surrenders itself to technology and the cult thereof, it must be lumped together with the other technicists. Technicists? It says it's Technizists. Since this is now an established fact, the metaphysical revolution must enter a state of suspension. Heidegger adopts a position counter to futurism. His critique of the technological world, the world of modernity, which he maintains even after the war, is contrasted with a different world, the homeland and everyday life of the agrarian petty bourgeois sphere. End footnote. Back to the body. Heidegger draws clear distinctions. These are elucidated in the context of the, quote, separations between being and becoming, being and semblance, being and thinking, and being and the, quote, ought, unquote, parenthesis, or value, in parenthesis. And they intend to explain why, since Plato, there has been a progression of philosophical decline, encompassing antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the, quote, modern epistemological interpretation, unquote. Heidegger. Heidegger thus makes his anti-enlightenment, anti-Cartesian impetus clear. In doing so, he deliberately reaches back to a point prior to Spinoza. While the relationship between being and becoming requires a nuanced assessment, Heidegger simultaneously attempts to demonstrate that Heraclitus and Parmenides meant the same thing regarding being. Footnote. At this point, this means that Parmenides' conception of being, which abstracts from, quote, coming to be and passing away, end quote, and privileges the, quote, gathered solidity of the enduring, end quote, is to be favored, while Heraclitus' position, quote, all being is becoming, end quote, is to be rejected. Reference is also made to Plato's, quote, becoming of becoming, end quote. A path leads from Plato to a reifying concept of being. He ignores the contradiction regarding the concept of being between Parmenides and Heraclitus. End footnote. Back to the body. The opposition between being and semblance is characterized as a specific one. Here there exists, quote, the real in distinction and opposition to the unreal, end quote. However, the objection is raised that semblance itself belongs to being. Semblance does, quote, not merely allow beings as such to appear, end quote, but conceals, quote, itself as semblance insofar as it represents itself as being, end quote. Only in this sense can one say that semblance is deceptive. Rather than dwelling on this point, one ought to distinguish between being and semblance at the very inception of philosophy. This requires recourse to the concept of truth and reflection upon the distinction between being and non-being, as well as the, quote, distinction between non-being and semblance, end quote. Although nothingness is not a being, it nonetheless belongs to being. It appears that the way out of the resulting dilemma lies through semblance, doxa. All three moments, being, non-being, and semblance, would have to be known. Nothingness, evil, would however become thematic and negated within this knowledge. The separation of being and semblance is also, of course, a real one insofar as being is affirmed here. Footnote. And this is in relation to the sentence. The opposition between being and semblance is characterized as a specific one. Here there exists, quote, the real in distinction and opposition to the unreal, end quote. And the footnote says, this differs somewhat from Parmenides' view, for the latter holds that human knowledge as knowledge of the semblance of the changing world is merely a matter of naming. For Parmenides, by contrast, cognition is oriented toward determinability. According to Engelhardt, Parmenides is connected with, quote, determinability as such, end quote, and the, quote, knowability and principle of the determinate, end quote. And those quotes are from Hans Peter Engelhardt. And footnote. Footnote, quote, semblance belongs to being itself as appearing. Semblance occurs within the being itself, along with that self, end quote. Heidegger. End footnote. Footnote, in order to, quote, assume his Dasein within the context of being, man must uphold it and distinguish it from semblance. He must, quote, wrest semblance into being from the abyss of nothingness, end quote. Quote, for nothingness is the negation of the totality of beings, the absolute non-existent, end quote. Quote, nothingness is the complete negation of the totality of beings, end quote. Heidegger. There, one also finds a detailed discussion of nothingness as a limited category. According to Introduction to Metaphysics, one must take the path to truth. Since the path to non-being cannot be taken, it becomes evident here that non-being is connoted with horror vacui, V-A-C-U-I, and with evil as a positive entity. This is reminiscent of Augustine and reveals a fixation on a fundamental Catholic Christian pattern. Footnote, quote, the Noein, or Noein, N-O-E-I-N, the act of apprehending, end quote, quote, the Noein, the act of apprehending, end quote, is said to be a passage and intersection of three things. It is, quote, fundamentally a decision for being against nothingness and thus a confrontation with semblance, end quote. Footnote, quote, if, however, all that stands opposed to being in these separations is not nothing, then it possesses its own being. Ultimately, it is even more, quote, being than that which is considered to be, quote, being, according to the restricted definition of the essence of being, end quote. Heidegger. Here, being is a mere framework and point of reference, and semblance is merely deception, since essence and appearance are phenomenologically excluded. Back to the body. Regrettably, the moment being is essentially distinguished from thinking. In Plato, it becomes thinking's object. Quote, being itself is understood in a specific way, as thus understood it is manifest to us, end quote. Heidegger. Understanding occurs within a specific perspective, yet thinking as an attempt is made to clarify through a recourse to Parmenides, actually signifies not merely the same as being, but rather apprehending and bringing to a stand. Nous signifies apprehension, quote, as acceptance, end quote, and appearance. Heidegger is concerned here with the critique of logic, and above all of the definition of logos as assertion. He criticizes the fact that logos, quote, as reason and intellect, end quote, has gained, quote, dominion over being, end quote. One must liberate oneself from this. Heraclitus advocates a specific necessity, that the logos, as the, quote, gatheredness of beings themselves, end quote, must be heeded, because humans are dealing with a being that is alien to them. The logos determines language. Since Plato, being as physis has been displaced by, quote, being as idea, end quote, a trend that persists through Kant and Hegel. The concept of the idea also undergoes a transformation with and since Plato. This represents a transition from truth to correctness, signifying a, quote, falling away from the primordial being, end quote. Heidegger, when the idea is placed in the context of the, quote, look of beings, end quote. Plato, The transition to the ideal becomes just as inevitable as the transition to the copy. Footnote: here too the difference from Parmenides becomes apparent, for in his view, as Engelhardt formulates it, quote, what is beings need not be understood, since qua aletheia it is always already understood, end quote. Hans Peter Engelhardt. This is also linked to the fact that for Parmenides it is regarded as, quote, unbegotten and imperishable, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Here being is an element of language, understanding, and hermeneutics. Gadamer continues this line of thought. End footnote. Footnote. In Heidegger's understanding, then, it is a matter of intuitive apprehension, that is, intuitive cognition. This demonstrates a certain selectivity. Know ein means to perceive, notice, recognize, consider, think, devise, signify. Correspondingly, nous signifies sense or reason. End footnote. Footnote. Logos essentially means to gather and to reveal. With reference to Heraclitus, an attempt is made to establish that logos signifies, quote, constancy, quote, permanence, and, quote, togetherness, end quote. Everything that occurs is said to originate from, quote, this constant togetherness, end quote. Heidegger does not entirely deny that logos also means speech, but he reinterprets it wherever possible. Footnote. At its core, Heidegger's critique targets the, quote, reinterpretation of Geist, bracket, spirit/mind, in bracket, as intelligence, understood as mere understanding in the sense of deliberation, calculation, and contemplation of given things, end quote, whereby this understanding is subject to organization. Geist as intelligence is viewed as merely instrumental, as in Marxism, positivism, and vulgar racism. These are regarded as forms of degeneration to which Geist, as culture, must be assigned. Scientific disciplines are held together solely by technology. See Heidegger's What is Metaphysics. Contrasted with this is Geist as, quote, that which sustains and governs the first and the last, end quote. Heidegger, Introduction to Metaphysics. According to Heidegger, Geist is to, quote, be, quote, resoluteness toward the essence of being, end quote. A, quote, empowering of powers and beings as such in their entirety, end quote. The question of being opens up Geist and with it, quote, an originary world of historical Dasein, end quote. It is the condition, quote, for assuming the historical mission of our people at the center of the Occident, end quote. Marcuse disagrees with this. See Marcuse, der Kampf gegen den Liberalismus in der totalitären Staatsauffassung, the struggle against liberalism in the totalitarian view of the state, published in Paris, 1939. Quote, heroic folkish realism, end quote, which posits as its fundamental thesis the, quote, whole prior to all, quote, members, end quote, parenthesis, parts, in parenthesis, end quote, and thus proclaims a, quote, wholeness represented by the folk, idealizes the peasantry. A quote, wholeness represented by the folk, end quote, idealizes the peasantry. Quote, in the course of this naturalism, the peasantry is transfigured as the only estate still, quote, bound to nature, end quote. The peasantry is celebrated as the, quote, creative primal source, end quote, of the eternal foundation of society, end quote. Marcuse. If at the same time the emphasis is placed on action and occurrence, this constitutes, quote, existential, end quote, opportunism, end quote. In contrast to Heidegger's perspective, the peasant population of Russia appears to Arendt as a, quote, unstructured mass, end quote. Hannah Arendt. End footnote. Footnote, quote, human being in its historical essence, an essence that opens up to history, is logos, the gathering and heating of the being of beings, end quote. Heidegger. However, the nature of language itself remains obscure. For Heidegger, it counts as, quote, primordial poetry, end quote. End footnote. Footnote, quote, idea signifies, quote, that which is sighted within the visible, the aspect, end quote. The, quote, look, end quote. Althusser. The idea must be grasped as anwesen, parenthesis, present/presencing, in parenthesis. Footnote, however, as soon as the essence of being lies in the what being as the being of the being, is also the most, quote, being-like aspect of the being, end quote. The being of the idea is transformed into a being. The idea is transformed, quote, into the deal. Quote, into the ideal, end quote. Heidegger. Heidegger's critique targets this, quote, development, end quote. Quote, the chorismos, the gulf between the idea as the genuinely existent, parenthesis, prototype and archetype, end parenthesis, and the genuinely non-existent, parenthesis, the copy and image, end parenthesis, is torn open, end quote. Appearance now takes on the character of a, quote, copy. It is, quote, semblance, end quote, deficiency. In rationalism, however, semblance appears merely as falsity, as, quote, the incorrect, end quote. Heidegger. Back to the body. In the history of modern philosophy, the relationship between being and ought subsequently became a central theme. Heidegger focuses on the neo-Kantian elements of the debate. The starting point is the idea that thinking has become, quote, the foundational and determining ground of being, end quote. Heidegger. But being, it is claimed, is, quote, no longer the decisive factor, end quote. Heidegger. The highest principle, as in Plato, is now the good, conceived as a higher form of being. With this, however, the, quote, ought emerges, quote, in opposition to being, end quote, and thought acquires its, quote, decisive role, end quote. The development reaches its culmination in Kant. In subsequent discussions, the establishment of values becomes the, quote, ground of the ought, end quote, a concept subject to strict limitations. The dilemma is already present in Plato. When Plato conceives of, quote, being as idea, end quote, viewing the idea as a model, these ideas transform into values whose validity must be asserted. Being and existence are surreptitiously attributed to them. Nor is the problem avoided by relabeling values as, quote, wholes, end quote. All this amounts to half measures. It is therefore necessary to return to a rigorous concept of being. Footnote, Heidegger abstracts from the fact that the, quote, ought belongs to the core of all ethics. Footnote, to clarify, Heidegger outlines a schema for relating being and ought, being and semblance, being and thinking, being and becoming. End footnote. Footnote, quote, but since values stand in opposition to the being of the being, conceived as fact, values cannot, for their part, be themselves, end quote. Footnote, in doing so, and this is in relation to the sentence, nor is the problem solved by relabeling values as, quote, wholes, end quote. And the footnote says, In doing so, Heidegger also turns against Nietzsche and the latter's philosophy of values. End footnote. Back to the body. What is appealing about Heidegger is the pre-Socratic prophetic tone, the sense of harmony with the gods and of a being that comes from above. This finds its counterpart in the way things, nature itself, speaking there either through or beyond a human medium, the prophet, speak directly and project into being in their own unique way. Consequently, epistemology or autonomous thought no longer serves as the starting point, for the foundation is already present. The philosopher inquires into the primordial realm of being, and things are unconcealed. That is the God's answer. It matters little that, regarding pre-Socratic thought, he draws only upon Parmenides and Heraclitus. They appear to Heidegger to be reliable, at least politically. At this point, it is worth looking back briefly. In 1929, Heidegger moved back to Freiburg, where he had secured a regular professorship. Early during the 1928/29 winter semester, Heidegger delivered the lecture course, Introduction to Philosophy. This introduction does not follow the usual classification. Here, too, the starting point is the human being, and the aim of arriving at philosophizing that transcends the sciences. The philosophical work must inquire into the primordial whole. Truth is said to co-constitute community. Insofar as Dasein exists within truth, statements about beings become possible, or rather, beings reveal themselves. It is being that constitutes the presupposition for beings. Footnote: this lecture that was being referred to was reconstructed by Ina Zama Speidel for a typewritten transcript by Hildegard Feich and a lecture transcript by Simone Moser, authored by Heidegger. Themes similar to those in this lecture appear in Metaphysical Foundations of Logic, which addresses the concept of, quote, time, sight, and the, quote, turn, kara, as well as a relationship to a, quote, wholly other, end quote, entailing the expectation of a different time and implicitly a different God. This study is of limited value. This is due not only to the author's stance as a proselyte slash catechumen, or his occasionally reactionary orientation, but also to a failure to properly distinguish between the depiction of a philosophical development and a historical narrative. The nature of the work as a philosophical historical novel also reveals instances where the boundary into kitsch is crossed. Specifically, the love story between Hannah Arendt and Heidegger. The title, quote, Master of Germany, end quote, Meister von Deutschland, had previously been used to characterize the Catholic Counter-Reformation absolutism of Ferdinand II. See Georg Schmidt's Der 30-jährige Krieg, the 30 Years' War. Georg Schmidt's account is permeated by references to reactionary, ultramontane positions as well as to national conservative or absolutist ones. This creates the impression in many places that he wishes to adopt, from a, quote, young conservative, end quote, perspective, the cause of the Imperial Habsburg party ex post. The perspective favoring a nation-state led by Upper Germany laments the failure during the 19th century to develop an alternative based on a nation-state led by Upper Germany, parenthesis, i.e. a Habsburg-led, quote, Greater Germany, end quote, solution, end parenthesis. The Lower Rhine, Hesse, Thuringia, and Saxony are also grouped with Upper Germany. And so the praise for the, quote, flexible statehood of the Old Reich, end quote, comes as little surprise. Reinhardt's study appears more enlightened regarding the 16th century. See Wolfgang Reinhardt, Das Augsburger Bekenntnis im politischen Zusammenhang in Horst Jesser's Das Augsburger Bekenntnis in 3 Jahrhunderten, 1530, 1630, 1730. End footnote. Footnote for Heidegger. Let me see. This footnote's in reference to the sentence, the philosophical work must inquire into the primordial whole. For Heidegger, this means here too taking a stand against propositional logic and aiming directly at the object, or rather at the manifestations of being, their truth. End footnote. Back to the body. This marks the starting point for the increasing self-presentation that characterized the period immediately following. Footnote. Weizsäcker notes that Heidegger had already oriented himself toward National Socialism prior to 1913. End footnote. The movement of thought must always recognize freedom. Back to this is the body again. The movement of thought must always recognize freedom as liberation within the human being, according to the Kant lecture. This points to history. Philosophy possesses a power over time that illuminates the essential nature of history and presents itself in the role of, quote, the knowing leader and guardian, end quote. The meaning of the being of time lies in, quote, passing away and coming to pass, end quote. This process is enacted by the leaders, the, quote, heroic philosophers, end quote. Heidegger. No, that's Rudiger Zafransky. That last quote. The combination of truth, being, occurrence, and upheaval breathes an expectation of history and documents a specific eschatology directed against the lower classes. Okay, and there's a number of footnotes here. Footnote. See Martin Heidegger, Kant und das Problem der Metaphysik. This possesses an anti-rational quality. It is a liberation experienced as feeling. And footnote. Footnote. The problem of history is addressed shortly thereafter. See Martin Heidegger, Hölderlin Heinen. See Martin Heidegger, letter to Karl Jaspers, dated December 20th, 1931. Footnote. Heidegger in his lecture course on Plato. Footnote. Heidegger reinterprets Plato's allegory of the cave and emphasizes the socialist state order even more strongly than Plato does. End footnote. Footnote. Nevertheless, regarding the year 1931, as in many other instances, Zafransky believes he can exonerate Heidegger. Quote, Heidegger chides with the NSDAP. Quote, fuck that up. Heidegger's siding with the NSDAP was nothing more than a political opinion, end quote. Rudiger Zafransky. This characterization is reinforced by a portrayal of the times that mirrors the conservative propaganda of the 1930s and 1950s. End footnote. Footnote. Where am I? Back to the body. 1933 then marked the hour of truth. True values now became the central theme. A, quote, new reality, end quote. A metaphysical reality had emerged. Footnote. Heidegger reportedly felt metaphysically electrified. See Martin Heidegger, Tübingen's speech of November 30th, 1933. And footnote. Footnote. National Socialism and the, quote, Greek early period, end quote, are drawn as parallels. See Rudiger Safransky's book. Ein Meister, abbreviated, which I think is Master of Germany. Or I don't know, I can't remember. Here, Rudiger Safransky includes a passage that serves to exonerate and apologize for Heidegger, revealing little critical distance from Heidegger or the events of 1933. Heidegger's involvement with National Socialism is attributed to the philosopher's political inexperience. He had simply been mistaken. The fact that National Socialism was a matter close to Heidegger's heart, and that he did not change his political convictions even later, is passed over. Heidegger had become a member of the NSDAP on the 1st of May, 1933, and in the same year, in a letter dated April 22nd, 1933, urged Carl Schmitt to join the party, though Schmitt had already done so. See Martin Heidegger letter to Carl Schmitt dated August 22nd, 1933. However, the difference between their respective commitments was obvious. Quote, Heidegger wanted revolution. Schmitt wanted order, end quote. Rudiger's Francie. One of his activities also involved denouncing others such as Baumgarten and Stadelmann. Back to the body. Heidegger's commitment took on a more concrete form. Heidegger made himself available to the NSDAP as a speaker on university reform and later participated in discussions regarding the establishment of a National Socialist faculty body. End footnote. Footnote. Never mind, no footnote. Back to the body. On May 26, 1933, an evening honoring Schlageter, marking the 10th anniversary of his death, took place in Freiburg. Heidegger delivered a speech there. In it he referred to the, quote, hardest death, end quote, that of the defenseless facing rifles, using turns of phrase reminiscent of being in time. Concepts such as homeland, folk, parenthesis, people/nation, in parenthesis, and world were transformed into virtues. Volkstum, parenthesis, national character/identity, in parenthesis, was interpreted in folkish, regionalist, and Alemannic terms. An AI overview says Alemannic refers to a group of Upper German dialects spoken by approximately 10 million people across 7 countries: Switzerland, southwestern Germany, France, Alsace, Austria, Vorarlberg, Liechtenstein, and isolated communities in northern Italy and Venezuela. The name derives from the ancient Alemanni, a confederation of Germanic tribes. Back to the text. Footnote. Albert Leo Schlageter, parenthesis 1894 to 1923, in parenthesis, hailed, like Heidegger, from the southern Alemannic region, and like him had attended the gymnasium, parenthesis, secondary school, in parenthesis, in Constance and later in Freiburg. Quote, Schlageter was active in the Catholic dueling student fraternity Falkenstein, end quote. Although originally intending to become a priest, he abandoned this plan after volunteering for service at the outbreak of the First World War, a conflict in which he viewed his own involvement as, quote, essentially religiously motivated, end quote. After the war, he joined the Freikorps, fighting first in the Baltic region, then in Silesia, and finally against the French occupation of the Ruhr. There he was arrested, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad in Dusseldorf on May 26, 1923. In 1933, he was subsequently, quote, declared the first National Socialist German soldier, end quote. I'm not sure if this is, I'm not sure, but this is kind of like, I think one of the, like, in some of like the, some of the research that's been done about like anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic motifs circulating within the Communist Party of Germany, or like nationalist German, like nationalist motifs circulating in the Communist Party of Germany in the 1920s. I think that, I don't know if it was Karl Radek or somebody else, made a speech like, or like some like big speech praising this guy as like a, I don't want to over exaggerate, but essentially some kind of like martyr against the a martyr in, again, a martyred figure in the in opposition to the wolfishness of Anglo-Franco imperialism, something like that. Footnote. See Victor Farias, Heidegger, piece abbreviated Heidegger. Quote, the meaning of the existential ontological structure of death lay in the, quote, opening of a horizon, end quote, onto finitude, and with it, onto the temporality in which being appears, end quote. End footnote. Footnote. Quote, and that quote was from Victor Farias. Quote, here too it becomes evident that in the political actualization of his fundamental ontological concept, Heidegger follows the folkish nationalist tropes and reminiscences of the World War that were current at the time, end quote. Victor Farias. Back to the text. At the same time, arrangements were made for Heidegger to assume the rectorship of the University of Freiburg. A, quote, reform was presented within the context of the National Revolution, incorporating an alignment with the SA. Scholarship and the, quote, destiny of the German people, end quote, were linked and fused. Three forms of obligation were posited: to the Volksgemeinschaft, national community, manifested as labor service; to destiny, manifested as military service; and to the spirit, manifested as service through knowledge. National Socialist students were cast as the vanguard of university reorganization, thereby enabling a new relationship between the university and the German people, or rather the state. Thus, Heidegger relied primarily on the student body and ideologically on the SA, parenthesis, a fact that evidently provokes certain analogies among some modern observers, end parenthesis. However, Heidegger also intervened actively not only through lectures but also through publications, organizational work regarding labor and academic camps, and involvement in the complex institutional power struggles of the time. Heidegger adopts a combative stance in his lecture, titled The University and the National Socialist State, The University in the National Socialist State, delivered on the 30th of November 1933. The university was to be understood as an element of the National Socialist Revolution, a new reality that emphasized historicity. The political circumstances of 1933 create a further need for the regime to establish its legitimacy. National Socialist professors called for a vote of confidence in Hitler. Heidegger delivered the speech at the, quote, rally of German academia for Adolf Hitler, end quote, on November 11, 1933. In it, Hitler appears as a hero, while labor is presented as the instrument of the folk. Of particular interest, however, was the general course of events as something defined by the folkish spirit. Footnote: the ceremonial handovers of the rectorship to Heidegger took place on the 27th of May, 1933. Farias devotes himself to a detailed analysis of Heidegger's speech and text. See Martin Heidegger, Die Selbstbehauptung der deutschen Universität, the self-assertion of the German university. And footnote. Footnote: on this variation of the conservative revolution, see W.D. Goodop's Zum Fallen, quote, Zum Fallen geneigt, end quote, inclined to fall, a note on Heidegger's politics, published in Manfred Burr, Hans-Jörg Sandkühler's edited volume, Philosophie in Weltbürgerlicher Absicht und Weltbürgerlicher Sozialismus, philosophy with a cosmopolitan intent and cosmopolitan socialism. And footnote, quote, the will to the essence of the German university is the will to scholarship as the will to the historical spiritual mission of the German people, end quote. Heidegger. The folk is identified with the essence. Destiny is identified as the governing authority. Philosophy, it is claimed, must constitute reality. However, the true beginning of the national revolution is yet to come. Scholarship is grounded in blood and soil. End footnote. Footnote here, and this is in reference to the sentence. What? Let's see if I can find it. Oh, I can't find it. But anyway, where am I? Here Heidegger invokes Plato, quote, everything great stands in the storm, end quote. Regarding the reality of academia and the labor service, see generally Klaus Brigleb, Unmittelbar zur Epoche des NS-Faschismus, Arbeiten zur politischen Philologie, 1978-1988. Blah, blah, blah. Bunch of literature that's all in German. Footnote. This included the legitimization of anti-Semitism and the persecution of political opponents. Zafransky, seeking to exonerate him, claims that Heidegger was not an anti-Semite. Nothing to that effect is to be found in his writings. Yet it is precisely Heidegger's political orientation that prompts a general re-examination of his philosophy. Quote, in a letter to Friedrich Wilhelm von Haarmann, Vittorio Klostermann requested an explanation regarding the widely voiced suspicion that the monumental Heidegger edition ... might contain smoothed-over sections or omissions of sensitive or offensive anti-Semitic passages. The publisher points out that in volume 69 of the Gesamtausgabe, collected works, a handwritten passage referring to a, quote, peculiar predestination of Jewry for planetary criminality, end quote, was omitted from the printed version. The volume's editor, Peter Trony, who also edited the recently published Black Notebooks, reportedly assumed that at the time that Heidegger had intended the passage to refer to the Jewish victims of National Socialism, end quote. In volume 39 of the collected works, which contains Heidegger's interpretations of Hölderlin and the abbreviation N-Zots, which I guess is like National Socialism, was in turn read as, quote, natural science, end quote, bracket, Naturwissenschaft, in bracket, end quote. Zafransky, by contrast, argues that Heidegger's National Socialism presents itself as quote, decisionist, end quote. He maintains that the human being is to be judged, quote, not by his thoroughness, but by his projection, end quote. Rudiger Zafransky. The concept of thoroughness is criticized by others. Ritter writes, quote, remembrance has taken the place of the deed, reaction has taken the place of action, and experiencing, reflecting, quote, thoroughness, end quote. End quote. Ritter. Cited by Günter Schultz. Nevertheless, Zafransky acknowledges that Heidegger categorized his colleagues into Jews and non-Jews and succumbed to a form of competitive anti-Semitism. The demand was for, quote, service to the folk, end quote. Farias, on the other hand, points to the conflict surrounding, quote, Neo-Freiburgia, end quote, in 1933, and to the purges and the book burnings of May-June 1933. In footnote, Heidegger's struggle against the university system dominated by full professors, Ordinarien Universität, reminds Zafransky of the, quote, student revolt of 1967, end quote. Quote, one ideal of the student movement of 1967 was the so-called, quote, abolition of the separation between manual and intellectual labor, end quote. It was also Heidegger's ideal, end quote. Zafransky. Heidegger, too, reportedly expressed support for the private Dozenten, unsalaried lecturers, end parenthesis. This thesis is not new. While Scheuch, writing from the perspective of a proponent of the, quote, social market economy, end quote, criticizes the hostility toward the economy and merely hints at the connection to the, quote, youth movement, end quote. Schelsky addresses the matter more directly. Helmut Schelsky, an SA member since 1932, in his work Die Arbeit und die Anderen, Klassenkampf und Priesterherrschaft der Intellektuellen. When Zafransky attempts to portray the historical era of the Weimar Republic, Zafransky follows a conservative pattern, one shared during that period by the right wing of the SPD. Quote, just as the democratic center in Weimar politics was ground down by the extremism of those seeking total transformation, so too did a retreat into extreme solutions dominate the, quote, philosophy of crisis, end quote, of those years. These solutions bore various names, quote, proletariat, the, quote, unconscious, quote, the soul, quote, the sacred, quote, folksdom, national/ethnic identity, etc., end quote. Rudiger Zafransky. But who constituted the democratic center, aside from a few social democrats, some liberals, and left-leaning centrists? Further details regarding the situation can be found in another source, Quote, the linchpin of any parliamentary system of government is the legislature's right to control the budget, end quote. Franz Neumann, Behemoth. The Structure and Practice of National Socialism, 1933 to 1944. A conflict arose concerning these oversight powers, involving, among others, the Court of Audit. Many areas of the quote, economy were now virtually exempt from oversight. Quote, this entire development was fully in line with the wishes of German industry. Its principal interest group, the Reichsverband der Deutschen Industrie, Reich Association of German Industry, even demanded further restrictions on the Reichstag's budgetary powers. The German People's Party, DVP, incorporated these proposals into its party platform, end quote. I'm assuming that's Franz Neumann. Quote, all expenditures were to be approved by the government. Dr. Poppitz of the Ministry of Finance, following Neumann's account here, articulated the underlying rationale. Quote, universal suffrage had brought social strata into the Reichstag that paid neither high income taxes nor special levies, end quote. Put more simply, those who did not belong to the bourgeois class. See Poppitz, Finanzausgleich, Fiscal Equalization in Handwörterbuch der Staatswissenschaften, Compendium of Political Science. And footnote. See Heidegger's lecture Die Grundfrage der Philosophie, the fundamental question of philosophy, in which the themes of history, quote, leadership, quote, state, quote, nation, and the, quote, destiny of the people, end quote, are central. And footnote. Footnote, the, quote, labor service speech, end quote, serves as a prime example here. In it he revisited the motif of the healthy national body, Volkskörper, drawing upon his own early work concerning Abraham a Sancta Clara. The, quote, a state-based order of a mystical Volksgemeinschaft, bracket, people's community, end bracket, end quote, is regarded as a sign of, quote, health, end quote. Victor Farias. And Martin Heidegger. I think these quotes might be like citations by Victor Farias. See Martin Heidegger's Nationalsozialistische Wissensschulung, National Socialist Training and Knowledge. Quote, for us, quote, work is the term for every regulated activity and action that is borne by the responsibility of the individual, the group, and the state, and thus serves the folk, unquote. Heidegger. Numerous references to being in time can be found. End footnote. Footnote, these are contributions to the student press, such as speeches for specific occasions, for instance the solstice celebrations of 1933. The speaker's stance is clearly National Socialist. See also the lectures in Heidelberg and Kiel delivered at the invitation of students as part of a lecture series. The lecture, The University in the New Reich, July 30th, 1933, is presented with only minor variations in Kiel. Farias therefore points to this continuity. Quote, the expectation of a savior had already become audible in his lecture course, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. End quote. Victor Farias. Amidst the, quote, struggle over institutions, end quote, Heidegger attempts to assert himself against competing approaches, such as those of Baumler, Krieg, or the Rosenberg office. While Heidegger views the others with mistrust, Erich Rotacker is the sole exception. See in particular Rotacker's study on the human sciences, Geisteswissenschaften, which stands in intellectual proximity to Heidegger. See Erich Rotacker, Logik und Systematik der Geisteswissenschaften. End footnote. Footnote, quote, to be historical means for the people as a whole, knowing that history is neither the past nor the present, but rather the acting and questioning that penetrates the present from a future pressing in upon it. To be historical means to possess knowledge, thereby liberating the past in its binding force and preserving it in its transformative greatness. This knowledge is the state itself, end quote. Heidegger, in the piece The University and the National Socialist State, from December 1st, 1933. The consequence of this, Heidegger argued, was that the NS state was a, quote, labor state, end quote, because the student was now simultaneously a political figure and a worker. Footnote. The March elections had yielded 44% of the vote for the NSDAP. Consequently, a plebiscite for Hitler was organized, parenthesis, November 12, 1933, in parenthesis. And footnote. Footnote. Heidegger's conception was that for him, the totality of workers was organized along corporatist lines, end quote. Heidegger. Footnote, quote, what kind of event is this, then? The people regain the truth of their will to exist, for truth is the unconcealment of that which renders people, in their actions and their essence, secure, clear, and strong. From such truth springs the genuine will to know, and this will to know is bound to the necessity of a self-responsible, folkish existence, end quote. Heidegger. End footnote. With the defeat of the Röhm faction, Heidegger lost a portion of his power base. The immediate consequence was his resignation from the rectorship, parenthesis, April 23, 1934, in parenthesis, a move made as an, quote, ultra-populist National Socialist, end quote. Although Heidegger continued to attempt to engage in politics, for instance, in shaping the Dozenten Academy, Lecturers' Academy, his retreat into a form of, quote, National Socialism on hold, end quote, grounded in metaphysics became evident. Footnote, insofar as his pedagogical standards can be discerned from his draft, they boil down to the creation of a certain atmosphere, an educational stance, the concept of the university as an educational community of life, the promotion of authority, and the fostering of spirit, community, and mindset. What is advocated is an almost monastic order and specific organizational structures for the curriculum. End footnote. Back to the body. Subsequently, Heidegger devoted himself primarily to his university work, interrupted only by occasional publishing activities. Footnote, one of his activities was his anti-Cartesian contribution to the 1937 Descartes Congress in Paris, an effort that other German quarters attempted to thwart but ultimately failed to stop. Another was his contribution to an anthology edited by Grassi, which the Rosenberg office tried to sabotage, an attempt prevented thanks to Heidegger's good relations with Goebbels. End footnote. Footnote, to list just a few examples of his publishing activities. Lectures on Parmenides, Nietzsche, Hölderlin, etc. Symptomatic is the statement made in the Nietzsche lecture, quote, war as an expression of the epochal will to power, end quote. Heidegger. And footnote, back to the body. The end of the war brought a change in circumstances. Heidegger was stripped of his professorship and his venia legendi, right to teach, until 1951. Nevertheless, Heidegger sought to remain influential. Evidence of this can be found in his lectures at Buller Hua, I don't know, and in Bremen, delivered to a national conservative and post-national socialist audience. There, he continued the critique he had previously initiated regarding Americanism and the Soviet system as manifestations of technology. Heidegger did not distance himself from anti-Semitism, nor did Heidegger do so in his letter to Marcuse, and in the letter Heidegger resorted to an untenable form of legitimation. He claimed to have expected from National Socialism, quote, a spiritual renewal of life as a whole, a reconciliation of social antagonisms, and a salvation of Western existence from the dangers of communism, end quote, and to have subsequently broken with the movement for that very reason. Yet he refused to distance himself after 1945, quote, because Nazi supporters proclaimed their change of heart in the most repulsive manner, end quote. Marcuse retorted that Heidegger had evidently, quote, confused the liquidation of Western existence with its renewal, end quote. Heidegger responded unequivocally by comparing the extermination of the Jews to the expulsion of East Germans. In a 1949 lecture in Bremen, he gave voice to even more blatant anti-Semitism. Some footnotes here. Footnote. The first Review Commission attempts to rehabilitate him. Only Adolf Lampa dissents. However, the French military government rejected the expert opinion. It did not wish to grant Heidegger emeritus status, but merely retirement. A second proceeding involved a negative assessment of Karl Jaspers. Footnote. Heidegger receives an inquiry regarding a call to Tübingen and a similar one for Munich. Both attempts fail. And footnote. Footnote. Zafransky takes this stance to an extreme. And that's in reference to what? The sentence, Heidegger did not distance himself from anti-Semitism. And it says, Zafransky takes this stance to an extreme. Quote, Heidegger rightly perceived as an outrage the demand made by the public that he distance himself from the murder of millions of Jews. For in doing so, he would have implicitly acknowledged a public judgment and imputed complicity in the murder to him. His self-respect compelled him to refuse this demand, end quote. Rudiger Safransky. Throughout his life, Heidegger refused to engage in self-criticism. End footnote. Footnote. The letter from Herbert Marcuse to Heidegger is dated August 28, 1947. Heidegger replied on January 20th, 1948. And footnote. Footnote. Quote, agriculture is now a motorized food industry. In essence, the same thing as the manufacture of corpses in gas chambers and extermination camps. The same thing as the blockade and starvation of countries. The same thing as the manufacture of hydrogen bombs. End quote. Heidegger. End footnote. Back to the body. In a sense, as Farias illustrates, the later Heidegger returns to his quote, homeland. This occurs in a lecture on Abraham a Sancta Clara, in a version now purged of anti-Semitic references. Nevertheless, the regional milieu remains evident here. a milieu shared by Abraham a Sancta Clara. Heidegger points to the Baroque era and Sancta Clara's use of imagery, praises the fanatical preacher for his love of white swans, and holds him up as a model, yet the deliberate omissions in this lecture point back to the early Heidegger. Footnote, see Martin Heidegger, Über Abraham a Sancta Clara. End footnote. Footnote, culturally and politically, the South Alemannic region continued to regard itself as part of Further Austria, Vorderösterreich. Its sphere of influence thus extends from Vienna to Freiburg. End footnote. Footnote, according to Heidegger, the task was to understand Abraham a Sancta Clara and to learn from him. The period following 1648 was marked by devastation and hardship in the wake of the Great War. The plague struck Vienna and the Turks besieged the city. Heidegger writes, quote, "That is why Abraham a Sancta Clara wrote at the time, quote, 'Among us one finds warmth, poverty, and God's mercy all in a single day, and our peace is as far removed from war as Sachsenhausen is from Frankfurt,' unquote." Heidegger. Farius links this to the observation that Sachsenhausen was also the site of a concentration camp, while Frankfurt was the venue for the Auschwitz trial. Heidegger contents himself here with knowledgeable allusions. The late 19th century in Heidegger's home region was marked by the conflict between Old Catholics and Catholic populism, a conflict that also had a social dimension. It was here that Heidegger grew up, supported by a mix of private and church-sponsored scholarships. The liberal world of his old Catholic schoolmates in Constance and his own world appeared to him as, respectively, the, quote, "authentic" and the, quote, "inauthentic" world. A similar confrontation exists at the university, specifically at the Faculty of Catholic Theology in Freiburg, where Heidegger began his studies in 1909. The clash between modernists and anti-modernists. Heidegger aligned himself with the anti-modernists. Meanwhile, in Austria, Dr. Karl Lueger had helped launch a Christian social anti-Semitic party and movement. As a student, Heidegger gravitated toward the Catholic youth movement and became active in the anti-modernist group, quote, Graubund, unquote. Certain anti-Semitic writings, some authored by members of the clergy, were widely circulated within the popular Catholicism. One such text by Behrens was drawn upon by Heidegger. He delivered a speech at the unveiling of a monument, donated by Lueger, to the, quote, court preacher Abraham a Sancta Clara, unquote. Parenthesis, 1644 to 1709, in parenthesis, known as the, quote, plebeian at court, unquote. This figure had fixated on two enemies, the, quote, barbaric Turks and the Jews, the latter being blamed for the plague on the grounds that they had poisoned the wells. Heidegger emphasized the, quote, simplicity of the village and the landscape, unquote, praising his homeland and its primordial Catholic vitality. It was within this context that Abraham a Sancta Clara was situated. He reportedly strove for the, quote, health of the people in soul and body, unquote, and stood as a counter-image to the prevailing culture of the time. Emphasis is placed on the Catholic-rooted character, deliberateness, provincial life, and an orientation toward the hereafter. And there's a number of footnotes here. The old Catholics, who had broken away following the proclamation of the doctrine of papal infallibility regarding ex cathedra pronouncements, drew their support predominantly from the middle class, with adherents holding liberal or pro-Prussian views. They belonged to a wealthier stratum of society than Heidegger's parents. Quote, the majority of Catholics from Kleinheimstetten, Meßkirch, and even Boiron belonged to that segment of German Catholicism whose political and religious positions were identical to those of the Austrian Christian socials led by Luger and Victor Farias. Adhering to the Catholic Church hierarchy's brand of populism, were characterized as disaffected with the state, devoutly religious, hierarchy-oriented, and, quote, anti-capitalist, agrarian, anti-Semitic, and deeply attached to their homeland, end quote. Rudiger Zafransky. Heimat was regarded as the, quote, church of the common people of Meßkirch, end quote. Footnote. Zafransky points to the contrast between the Catholic world and the bourgeois world on several occasions. This loyalty to one's home region, Heimatreue, has a particular coloration. The conflict, and footnote. Footnote, the conflict begins with the promulgation of the 1907 encyclical. End footnote. Where am I? Sorry, I was spaced out. I left out where I was. Heimat was regarded as the, quote, church of the common people of Meßkirch, end quote. And footnote. Footnote. Zafransky points to the contrast between the Catholic world and the bourgeois world on several occasions. This loyalty to one's home region, Heimatreue, has a particular coloration. And footnote. Footnote. The conflict begins with the promulgation of the 1907 encyclical. And footnote. Footnote. Anti-modernism applies particularly to his teacher, Breg. See the work of Karl Breg. Die Grundzüge der Philosophie vor vom Sein, Abriss der Ontologie. The Fundamentals of Philosophy 4 on Being, Outline of Ontology, published in Freiburg, 1896, which Heidegger engaged with while still a schoolboy. End footnote. Footnote. From 1848 onwards, there was a, quote, campaign for the restoration of Catholicism, end quote, initially involving Sebastian Brunner, then Luger, the new leader of the, quote, Christian social movement, end quote. Its organ was the Österreichischer Volksfreund. See Brigitte Hamann, Hitler's Wien, Jahre eines Diktators, Hitler's Vienna, A Dictator's Formative Years. And footnote. Footnote. The Catholicism prevalent there this is in relation to the sentence. As a student, Heidegger gravitated toward the Catholic youth movement and became active in the anti-modernist group Graubund. And it says, Catholicism prevalent there, characterized by anti-Semitism and a potential leaning toward clerical fascism, was committed to anti-liberalism and anti-enlightenment views. One of its designated enemies was the SPD. The journal Der Graal was edited by Richard von Kralik. Quote, finally, it is of significant importance that Kralik, drawing on the romantic Catholic ideas of Karl Ludwig von Haller, Friedrich von Schlegel, and Franz von Baader, developed a social model based on the corporate state, a model that would later become entrenched in clerical fascism, end quote. And that's from, I think that quote is from Victor Farias. End footnote. Footnote. Regarding the Jews, the corresponds to medieval notions. Jews had been expelled from Vienna twice. In 1491 and 1669. The Turks were regarded as a, quote, carbon copy of the Antichrist, end quote. Moreover, Heidegger was generally xenophobic. There were also political reasons for his sparing Protestants in his attacks. After all, the Habsburgs sought to win over the Protestant princes to participate in a military campaign against the Turks. Actually, the he there might not be Heidegger, it might be Abraham of Santa Clara. Yeah, I think that's Abraham of Santa Clara. Footnote, and this is in relation to the sentence, emphasis is placed on the Catholic-rooted character, deliberateness, provincial life, and an orientation toward the hereafter. And the footnote says, here Farias suggests there is also an affinity with the position of Richard von Kralik, whose agenda, quote, revolutionary and conservative, end quote, sought to align itself with Clemens Maria Hofbauer and the Romanticism of Friedrich von Schlegel, a Romanticism oriented toward a greater German and neo-Catholic outlook. The exaggerated characterization of German as the, quote, most perfect language, end quote, is also found in Heidegger. Kralik, too, operates with the concept of a Volksseele, and parenthesis, national soul, in parenthesis. Back to the body. While Heidegger later turned away from the system of Catholicism, he did not abandon certain elements of Christianity and metaphysics. He continued to defend the, quote, values of medieval Catholicism, end quote. And I believe that's Farias. And the footnote says, Heidegger's habilitation thesis also points to this. Die Kategorien und Bedeutungslehre des Duns Scotus, the theory of categories and meaning in Duns Scotus, from 1915. This focus on the Middle Ages parallels the conceptual pattern found in Auguste Comte, for whom the Middle Ages represents statics and order, while the modern era and the Enlightenment stand for dynamics and history. See Diethard Behrens and Anna Maria Wülfer-Melior, Soziologie als Natur und Geschichte, Sociology as Nature and History. A fully revised version of this project study, Sozialwissenschaft als Natur und Geschichte, Social Science as Nature and History, 1987, by Diethard Behrens and Anna Maria Wülfer-Melior, is forthcoming. End footnote. Back to the body. Heidegger conceives of theology as a positive science of faith within a system of sciences, a system defined by the fundamental distinction between sciences of being, parenthesis, as positive ontic sciences, end parenthesis, and the science of being, parenthesis, philosophy as an ontological science, end parenthesis. The science of faith is presented in a very narrow sense, yet it is also understood as the science of believers. Attempts are made to ground it through a circular interplay of systematic and practical orientations. Insofar as it concerns a community of faith, quote, theology as the science of faith viewed as a historical mode of being is at its innermost core a historical science, end quote. To the extent that theology possesses, quote, the character of a practical science by its very essence, end quote, it is a, quote, science of God's action, end quote, a notion that points to a rigid theism. The simultaneous assertion of God's transcendence leaves room for only one interpretation, that God's action manifests itself in natural events and human works. This interpretation also shapes Heidegger's construction of early Greek philosophy. Footnote: see the account of the development of science in Rotacher, particularly the section Philosophy and the Individual Sciences. And footnote. Footnote: see Martin Heidegger, Phänomenologie und Theologie, Phenomenology and Theology. Originally delivered as a lecture in Tübingen on March 9, 1927, and Marburg, February 14, 1928, in Marburg. A second part was added, quote, the positivity of theology and its relationship to phenomenology, end quote. Also incorporated is the letter dated March 11, 1964, containing references to the theological discussion, the problem of non-objectifying thinking and speaking in contemporary theology. Das Problem eines nicht objektifierenden Denkens und Sprechens in der heutigen Theologie. Held at Drew University, Madison, USA, April 9th to the 11th, 1964. The text was first published in Archive de Philosophie, France. And footnote, footnote, faith is described as a, quote, mode of existence of human Dasein, end quote, parenthesis, human being there, in parenthesis, and the crucifixion as a, quote, historical event, end quote. Existence in faith points to a, quote, participating, end quote, that is given with faith and through faith. A hiatus is suggested between science, understood as, quote, freely enacted, conceptually revealing objectification, end quote, and theology. The necessity of, quote, thematizing faith, end quote, can, quote, never be deduced from a purely rational devised system of sciences, end quote. Faith arises from faith for the sake of faith. Here, theology is shifted into the realm of religious irrationalism, a spectrum ranging from credo quia absurdum and the kind of subjectivization prevalent in pietism, to the concept made sociologically explicit in Thomas' theorem. The latter posits that every human action entails real consequences, regardless of how unreal the definition of the situation may have been. See Dorothy Swain Thomas and William Isaac Thomas's The Methodology of Behavior Study, Chapter 13, in The Child in America, Behavior Problems and Programs. Yet on the one hand, such a, quote, science of faith, end quote, becomes indistinguishable from a delusional system. On the other, theology is reduced to a cult of feeling, or in Heideggerian terms, Stimmung, parenthesis, mood / attunement, in parenthesis. Footnote, theology is described as, quote, conceptual knowledge regarding that which in the first instance allows Christianity to become an originally historical event, end quote. Quote, Christianness, end quote. Christlichkeit, end footnote. Footnote, insofar as Heidegger discusses the relationship between philosophy and theology, the topics addressed are conventional. The corrective function exercised by philosophy relates primarily to pre-Christian content. To the extent that these still exist, they determine, quote, the theological concept, end quote. Though this correction is merely formal, it can only do so insofar as problems have become thematic within scholarship itself, allowing the philosophical question, quote, concerning the primordial ontological constitution of beings, end quote, to intervene. End footnote. And that is the end of the chapter, or the section of the chapter, on the philosophy and theory of Jean-Paul Sartre. The section being titled a brief excursus, a brief note on Heidegger. Thank you so much for listening. The next section is titled a marginal note on Löwit, as in Karl Löwit.